Hello, everyone, and welcome to Grace at the Table. We are so happy to have you join us for our next installment in our panel discussion series on kingdom and culture, where we hope to take topics we encounter in our daily lives and current culture and interpret and analyze them through Scripture in light of God's kingdom. We hope that you'll join us by interacting on today's topic by texting in your comments and questions live for us to interact with. The text number is 443-499-2611 and will be on your screen if you need to reference it later. All questions are sent to us completely anonymous, so feel free to ask any question, no matter how crazy or embarrassing it may seem, because we will never know it was you. We really want these times to be as interactive and helpful as possible for those watching, so please send in any questions you might have for us to add to our discussion. We are very excited to dig into this new topic with you all, so let's get started. All right. Hello, and welcome back to Grace at the Table. Today we are joined by Brendan, Eric, and Don. And again, yes, hello. And to start, a couple housekeeping items. We just want to make sure we get this out of the way first before we get rolling. So we've mentioned before from last week, we talked about sex and singleness, and we mentioned that we were going to come back and we're going to talk about marriage and sex. So that's what we're going to do today. It's kind of a part 2 of what we did last time, but knowing that that is the topic, parental advisory warning. We're just warning you right now. We want to get this out of the way. We've said it before leading in, and we want to say it again now. This is probably not a conversation for tiny ears. If you are in a place where you cannot hear this openly, or maybe you shouldn't, this is your chance to go put earbuds in, turn it off. Yes, this is why God invented headphones. You know, this is your chance to respond to that. So we're giving you a warning so that it doesn't start playing, and then all of a sudden you're like, I don't want my kids to hear that, or I'm in a public place and I was playing it. No, if you're in your car and your kids are in there, this is your chance. You can turn it off. So you've been warned, because the content, while we are going to attempt to be as respectful and appropriate as possible, the content, in some degree, it is what it is. And I think you understand.
And we've gotten some really great and specific questions.
Very specific questions. So knowing that, just be warned as you head into this conversation.
It may even be a situation where, as a parent, you may even want to watch it and screen it first before even some of your teenagers might even listen to some of this stuff.
Yes, we're not saying don't let young people hear it. I think that's up to you, how you decide to handle that. But we're letting you know this is what you're headed into. So if you need to screen it or you need to turn it off, this is your chance. So be warned. You've been warned. Second, I wanted to take an opportunity real quick to tell you, we always tell you to text in questions anonymously, but we've never actually explained to you how that works. And I want to make sure, especially for a topic as sensitive as this one, that you understand very briefly how that works. So I have in front of me an iPad, and it is coming from an unknown number. And when you text in, you are actually not texting directly to me. You are texting to another anonymous number that is being manned by someone who is not on the stage, who is then taking those from that number that has no contact list in it, and is copying your questions over to the other number, which is what I'm getting. So every question that I'm getting is coming from one phone number, and it's not yours. So if you have any concern about me figuring out, I recognize a number, whatever, I will not, and neither will they. Everything is coming from one place, and it all looks the same to us. So if you do decide you have something you want to text in, when I say it's anonymous, it's actually anonymous. We're not going to know it's your number. I just want to clarify that.
So let's get real.
Yeah, so if you have something you want to say, this is your chance. We're going to take anything you guys have, and we'll try to respect every question. As long as we'll be tasteful. I'll put it that way. We'll be careful, but still, we will ask your question. Okay, so diving in. We're going to go right in. You guys ready? So, in light of last week's conversation, what is the purpose of sex in marriage, and is the marriage covenant predominantly a sexual covenant? When we say sex, how are we defining that as well? Because we need to set some ground rules for this conversation so that we all know what we're talking about moving forward.
Yeah, and I guess there's a couple questions in that first question. And actually, maybe I'm taking them in reverse order. When we say sex, how are we defining that? Because we realized that actually that probably would have been a really good question to tackle last time.
So apply that to last week's as well if you're watching these in sequence. This is part 2, but that should have been in part 1. Yes.
Yeah. Because especially we're trying to think of this more broadly, and and even in the singleness one of like what's okay and what's not, and I think that's a really important question. Like, what do we mean when we say sex? And so I think I don't know about you guys. I think here's how I was thinking about that. Because Don, I remember something you had mentioned. Maybe it was last time about how that. Ever since the fall, that shame has been really seemed to be connected to this, and you see in the garden, when they fall, they're covering up their sexual organs, like that. Like that was like the first reaction. Yeah. And so I think that that's where like we find the definition of sex, that it's the sort of the involving the sexual organs. Okay. And so that means that I think for the purpose of this conversation and importing back into last conversation, I think it's better to take a broader definition of sex, that not just intercourse, but the use of sexual organs and their sexual function is what we mean when we're talking about this topic.
Okay. Agree, disagree? I mean, if everyone's on the same page, nods are good.
I mean, maybe, of course, we can be more specific in defining there, but...
Yeah, I guess kind of one of the ways I think about it is in God's design for marriage, and this maybe speaks to part of the other question you were answering, is marriage, and I think, as we've kind of studied out recently, I think Jay Adams kind of communicates really well, that the heart of marriage is a covenant of companionship. That the reason for marriage in Genesis 2:18 is because God says it's not good for man to be alone. So he creates marriage as the solution to that. And so sexual intimacy is part of the expression. It's both an expression of and a means to experiencing that oneness of union and companionship that God designed marriage to be. But there's, in my mind, there's a difference between that sexual intimacy that is cultivating that oneness and sex acts, because sex acts is a much broader kind of concept that involves, using our physical being in a way for sexual purposes. So it might even be a little broader than just the sexual organs. It's kind of, because we can fantasize sexual things and not have our organs involved.
That's a good point.
But at the same point, I'm not sure that doesn't kind of cross a line. At least Jesus seems to say it does.
Yeah. Okay. And you said that marriage is a covenant of companionship, which kind of gets to the second part of your question of you asked, is the marriage covenant predominantly a sexual covenant? And I've been thinking a lot about that phrase from when we were talking about as pastors the divorce and marriage and things like that, and the covenant of companionship. I really like that phrase, and so I don't. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit more? Don.
Well, I don't know how much more I'd have to say about it. I mean, I think the idea is that marriage is intended to be a relational covenant, first and foremost. And it has multiple dimensions. There's an emotional dimension, there's a spiritual dimension to that, and there's a physical dimension to that. And so sexual intimacy is just one aspect of the love that is to characterize that, that covenant of companionship where two people, to some degree, as in a reflection of the Trinitarian relationship that Father, Son, and Spirit have, come together to become one. So.
Yeah, and so I think maybe that even gets at the first part of the question of what is the purpose of sex in marriage, is that it functions in that covenant of companionship. And last time we were talking about how sex is self-giving love in that covenant, and so it's the self-giving love that furthers that intimacy, that companionship between husband and wife.
Yeah. So, like, I know, because I think last time we briefly touched on this, the concept that sometimes this area of life and existence for people, while it is a part of your being and a part of your world, that it may at times get over-elevated in its importance and the role that it plays in your life. We talked about that for single people and kind of their desire and the role that that plays in their life. But for married people, do you feel that that would apply to them as well, that sometimes there can be an overemphasis on this area of marriage as a piece of the marriage, maybe that's out of proportion in an unhealthy way as well? Or
I think yes, and especially, at least, especially in single people thinking about marriage, this I think often takes an outsized view of how people think about what to look for in a spouse. And I'm like, this is in the covenant of companionship, this is a dimension of that, but I don't think it's even it's not the primary dimension of that.
So if you were saying, like, for a marriage, it's a foundational piece of a marriage, is that a yes or no to that, and then why?
Is it a foundational piece?
And then explain, like, if you say yes, what that would mean.
Are you saying is sexuality a foundational?
Yeah.
I think it is, but when
Because we're
you say
talking about
foundational, depends how
overemphasizing.
you define that. It is an important component of the dimensions of what that covenant of companionship involves. But if you elevate that to think that marriage is primarily a covenant of sexual, relationship, that's the purpose of it. And that's not an uncommon way, I think, that people think, because they see that, they think that marriage was designed to fill the earth, to produce children.
Yeah, and that would actually be kind of the even in, it's not just a secular thing, like the Catholic understanding of marriage is, I think, puts sex a little bit more at the center of this, that its purpose is procreation.
Okay.
And I don't think that's the purpose. I think that's part of God's design, but the purpose is that union and oneness that reflects something about who God is in himself.
Yes,
Okay.
I think I wouldn't use the word foundational. Maybe I'd use the word fundamental, that it's a fundamental component. Yeah. Foundational implies to me this is what you're building it on, and that's not, like, sex is not what you're building your marriage on.
I chose that word on purpose. I agree with what you just said, but I chose that word on purpose. No, I'm glad you broke it down. That's exactly what I meant when I asked the question. Is it foundational? Because I think for a lot of people, they would see it as foundational. This is the baseline of everything, and everything else is built on top of the success of that. And you're saying that's not how you would view it. So
correct.
That you are answering the question I have asked, and that is great.
Well, I think you talked about the idea of being was it overappreciated, the words used?
Overemphasized. Or
So I think it can be overemphasized or underemphasized.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of times it comes from the nature, historically in the church here in America, oftentimes we have people who either sex is bad or sex is God. And I think that leads into marriage either having an overemphasis on it and this being the defining thing in a marriage, or being underappreciated and underemphasized and almost become an issue of you're not coming together as one flesh as God calls you to as well. So I think it can go either way in that process.
Good point. Okay. All right. Other thoughts on that before I move on to my next question? No? Okay. So if sex isn't about self-gratification, which Brendan brought back up from our previous conversation, but about mutual self-giving love, then what are some of the ways that goes wrong in a marriage, and what should that look like for us to act that out or live that out?
Yeah, and so I do think if you haven't listened to the last time's message, even though it's sex in the single Christian, if you're married, it was really just like the fundamentals of like what sexuality is all about. Yes. Go back and listen to that.
That was our baseline.
Yes, but I think that's the way that it can often go wrong in marriage, at least one of the ways, is really the same way that it goes wrong in singleness, is that I think in our fallenness and the way that we approach the issue of sex is we keep trying to turn it into self-gratification. And I I think that's an innate fallen problem, but our whole culture is set up to press that too, that itself is about sex is self-gratification, it's self-actualization. And so there's obvious ways that goes wrong in singleness, but oftentimes we, even in trying to adhere to a biblical sexual ethic, we're like, okay, I'm gonna wait till I'm married, but then I bring that same assumption into marriage, that it's about me and me feeling good and me getting what I want. And so I think rather than saying, oh, here's 3 different sex acts where this is obviously wrong in marriage, I think it's more a principle here that if I'm approaching sex in my marriage as about me and even just about satisfying my desires, and not about that this is a companionship and intimacy and I am for my wife, then anything that flows out of that is already wrong. It doesn't matter what it is. Like, you've already gone wrong.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I might add a little bit to that. I think when we take something that God intended to be an expression of this mutual self-giving love that you're describing, and I think 1 Corinthians 7 is a great place to see the picture of that. We taught on that a few weeks ago, so I won't go into that in detail, but when you take that and turn it into something that becomes me-focused, self-centered, by definition, you have turned something God designed for good into lust. Because that's the definition of lust, in that we're taking this good gift and desire and turning into something that is focused on us and gratifying our physical desires.
Yeah.
Well, I think part of it too is thinking about the foundational aspects of how they think about these things, because it's not about me, because it really is designed as a way to kind of demonstrate, like you were saying earlier, kind of go back to the reality of it. It's some way an example of really how the Trinity works in some respect, and essentially becoming husband, wife, one flesh. So much of it then also comes down to things like communication and things like working together to figure out what is as a couple, what is your sex life look like. And it comes down to things like consent and everything else that would be the same true in this, well, no, not in a Christian sense, but in the world sense. The idea of consent, obviously talked about single world, but in the married, and obviously in the Christian world, that's not obviously the same. I don't need to go emphasize there. But in a marriage, then it talks about this idea like, consent and communication and ongoing working together to figure out how do you develop intimacy together in that process.
Forms of respect for the other person that you're in connection with in this. Yes.
Yeah, one other thing I would add to that, because I wouldn't want this to be lost, is that the interesting paradox is, and this is kind of, you see this in other aspects of Christianity as well, is that if we do things with a focus on us, we kind of lose the intended benefit of that. But the paradox is if we do those things with the heart of giving ourselves sacrificially to others, then we experience the joy and the delight and the fulfillment of that. And so, by approaching your sexuality in marriage in a self-giving love way doesn't mean that you're not going to experience gratification and fulfillment. I think you'll experience a greater measure because it will be more than just physical. Yeah, and it will involve the spiritual and the emotional, and when that is working. It'll be functioning
as it's designed to.
Yeah. And obviously, as you say, the question being, where does it go wrong? I think it is when it's not talk about these things together. You're not actually thinking about things like consent and things like that. That's where it can go really wrong, because then it becomes about me. It becomes about not actually good for both people in that process. That's where it can really go wrong, I think, in many ways.
Yeah. Now, this is not on the question list, but I'm going to throw you all this curveball, because what else am I here to do, right? So this is my question, because as the non-married person that's up here, I'm coming from a slightly different perspective on this, obviously, but we're still all having this conversation. So my question is, I think in my thinking, it's very common for the world to make the sexual stuff about the physical. But it seems from what we've talked about so far that there's actually a really strong intimacy component to this that actually might be more predominantly important in what's actually going on than just the physical. And my question to you is, do you feel like that's something that the culture has twisted around in the way that we think about this, that maybe all the sexual stuff for your marriage is a lot more in focus about the intimacy part of it, and that the physical part is just part of how you get to that place and how that's created? Or is that going too far in the other direction to say that?
I'll start, because I think there's an irony that I think that our culture is sort of talking out of both sides of its mouth here.
Okay.
Because I think when in the world's view of sex as it relates to singleness, that it's not about intimacy. It's just about physical pleasure.
That's exactly
and go and
right.
do
They're
your thing.
like, there's no intimacy. This is just physical and just
reduces
recreation.
it down to the physical
so there's no
act
consequence to that too. Right.
But then our culture says when you get into marriage, all of a sudden now this is the foundation of intimacy, and you have to have a great sex life to have a great marriage. And I'm like, well, which one is it?
They don't know.
And that's where I was thinking about the reality. Oftentimes, overgeneralization. Oftentimes, what they talk about in the world is this reality that the guy will give emotional to get to the physical, and the girl will give physical to get to the emotional. And oftentimes, what it is, it's just an overemphasization on the physical, and you're not thinking about the totality of the relationship. It's overemphasizing the physical piece, where it becomes then the foundation. Thinking about both singleness and in a married life, the foundation aspect of intimacy becomes just the physical, and it's a skewing of how God designed it.
Yeah, because one of the things I think is always good, like as a single person, when I weigh this stuff out and I'm thinking this through, right? One of the things I like to ask myself is, it's not just about what do I get if I go this route or I think this way. It's what am I sacrificing if I go that way too? Because it's very important to consider what you might be losing when you make a choice. And I think the culture really doesn't tell you to think like that, so they tell you what you're getting, and that's always part of the promise. I feel like that's how sin and distortion works. They kind of tell you, this is what you'll get if you go this way, but they don't really mention what you might lose. They don't talk about what you're going to sacrifice if you make certain choices. So they don't really bring up the intimacy loss, and that's part of, even for people that maybe if you do decide you're going to have a ton of sex before you're married with a bunch of different people, that the intimacy part is part of what really you're putting in jeopardy there in some way. That's more what you're losing than the physical piece alone. And there's really no conversation, I feel like, that happens about that. But I think if this is really so much more about that and what you're able to build through sex in your marriage, then I would think that's got to be, like, that should be towards the forefront of your thinking as we consider the rest of the stuff on this page that we're going to talk about, and even as you think through this. Is that something you agree with?
And what's lost even in that thinking when it's applied to marriage, that, okay, sex has to be at the foundation of intimacy, that's a pretty rocky, shaky foundation to build a marriage on.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the reality is you're going to get old and saggy, and it's like that's just not.
Things won't always work as they once did.
Yes. And so I think that view just fundamentally neglects that the foundation of our being is spiritual, and I think the foundational intimacy of marriage is a spiritual intimacy that leads to an emotional and physical are all kind of combined, flowing out of a spiritual intimacy.
So in some ways, maybe sex is the pinnacle point where all of those pieces meet, the spiritual, the emotional, and the physical, to that intimacy in some degree. And maybe that's part of God's design of what makes it so special that he has for
I think
people.
when you overemphasize the physical too, you do underemphasize the importance of communication and respect and humility and all those different pieces. If it becomes so much easier to become about yourself, it's just a physical act.
Yeah. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, I think there's quite a bit of evidence to that reality that, sexual intimacy is much more than physical. I mean, it's alluded to, I think, in 1 Corinthians 6, where Paul talks about there's kind of this uniqueness to sexual sin because it's more than a physical thing. There's a spiritual component to it that he almost equates to how you kind of, are joined with Christ as a comparison. But I think there's evidence just in the way people, relate to the whole area of their sexuality. I remember reading, about a survey of 700 married couples that were done, and they were asked, what is the most important thing to you in a healthy sexual relationship? And for the females, the most important thing was emotional intimacy, that if there isn't a cultivation of the emotional intimacy, it's very hard for them to kind of engage fully. And for males, what was fascinating is it's all tied up in identity. That if a guy feels like he's not doing well, in the bedroom, he feels bad about himself. And so you can see that this is much more than physical and just how it relates to the wholeness of our person.
Yeah, and that's part of why, just to reemphasize why we're even up here talking about this, because I know a lot of people might wonder, why are you doing this and why are you doing it like this in this setting? This is part of why, because this is a deeper, broader thing that affects people in much more dynamic ways than just what people physically are or aren't doing. That's really not fully the conversation that we're up here to have. This is about a broader picture of spiritual and marital health and how it affects you as people and how important that is, and us recognizing that to have this conversation, because it doesn't always get talked about. But the value of this in a marriage really is reflective of other pieces of what's going on. And I think that's why people often say that, but maybe they don't explain it very well, that that's why it's like reflective of other issues. People often say, well, if your sex life isn't good, maybe that's reflective of other things going on in your marriage. That's part of why, because it's so connected to everything that's going on.
Well, I think one of the other pieces of that too, we talked about this a little bit over text yesterday actually, was part of the reason why we want to do this is because, one, historically, the churches in general, not just our church, but church in America in general, hasn't talked about these things.
Yeah.
And so in turn, if we aren't talking about these things through a scriptural lens, we're leaving people to hear about it only from the world's perspective.
Yeah.
And oftentimes it's skewed and wrong. And then not only that, but I think one of the other differences what's changed over the past 50 years or so is that even 40, 30 years ago, things like pornography weren't as easily accessible as they are today. And so there was a situation where it was easy in some respects, easier to shelter away from some of those things. The exposure wasn't as wide. But we're in a situation today that the average age of pornography exposure is in early elementary school. And so just growing up in that world, the porn culture has skewed so much of how people think about these things that it needs to be talked about and brought to light in a way. And I think because of the fact that specifically like the 35 and younger crowd, because they grew up in this culture so much, it's much more easily talked about in a way that maybe wasn't the case 30 years ago.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, as the youngest up here, I think I'm the youngest. Am I the youngest? I think I'm the youngest, yeah. Probably not by a ton, but yeah. I would agree with that. I mean, as I talk to people from different generations, different ages, and across the spectrum, I mean, things like this were not always talked about previously in people's households or in the church. And so I understand that some people may have like reservations about stuff like this. It can be a little uncomfortable, but I think our approach is more that it's in the Bible, and we would all agree from our previous chat that we had last time, this isn't wrong stuff. We're not up here to, hash out things or try to be dirty or filthy. This is talking about what God's designed and how to reserve this and protect it and respect this so that we're as close to what He has for us, which is a good thing, as possible.
Yeah. And that's part of the reason why we want to try and get into some of the specifics, even though, it's just the reality of those are the things that kids today are facing and hearing about and seeing, and it's like, we got to be able to address those from a biblical mindset, and if we're not, we're doing them a disservice because they're going to learn about it elsewhere. Yeah,
I mean, as the young person, again, I'm just saying, if your kid's listening to any hip-hop music, anything we're probably going to talk about up here today, unfortunately, is not going to be new information unless they are just letting it go right over their head, but it's there.
Yeah, and even just more of the positive spin, not just like they're hearing about this elsewhere, but if sexuality is a good gift from God designed for marriage, then we as Christians should be talking about this. Like, this should be where open and honest, humble conversations can happen.
Yeah, and really our heart and prayer for this is to, one, be instructional, hopefully a little bit, but also two, hopefully it's educational for parents thinking about having this conversation with their kids.
Yeah.
Because these are the things that they probably be exposed to in some form or fashion. And so it's given them the tools, hopefully, to be able to have those conversations in a really healthy manner.
Yeah, agreed. All right, so with that all laid out, we are now going to start to dive into some of the more specific questions where we're going to get into some interesting things. So, first question, is all sexual activity in marriage okay, or are there still things that are off limits? So this is a blanket statement that I'm making. Now I'm going to drop into some specific pieces of that question that we're going to hopefully address. So part one.
Start there first. I'm going to take a moment. 'Cause the way I went through thinking about these things is I really appreciated I was surprised to find how many different really good, solid, in doing research to see if I'm crazy or trying to confirm or figure out where I was
crazy.
I was surprised how many different Christian organizations have some specifics in this world.
Yeah.
And I thought the way that John Piper laid out the way he thinks about these things were really helpful. So I just want to take a moment to read his kind of like 4 overarching principles that he then applied into the different pieces.
All right, and
so
then I ask my questions.
And then it goes into the different pieces and we can filter through those. And I'm curious your guys' thoughts and whether you agree or disagree with these.
Well, first, do we accept Piper is what we're going to find out. And then we will decide if we do, how we'll apply it next.
So his first one was basically it would be wrong if it prohibited the Bible. That's clear. Like, if it's wrong if it was prohibited strictly in the Bible.
So if the Bible says no, don't do this, then it's off.
Done.
Okay.
Number 2 would be it would be wrong if it were unnatural.
Okay.
That'd be the second principle he follows.
Okay. Do we need to define what unnatural? Yeah. Do we need to define unnatural?
What he wrote here. Hold on.
We're assuming you listened to something or read something more than that. So
that would be in the sense of like we talked about before. I'm gonna wait 1 second to let child run out.
Okay. Right. Get out, kid.
So the way he talked about was like how is it unnatural? This is a tricky one. Male and female genitalia clearly made for each other. So that's where it gets into things like homosexuality. You can see how it'd be unnatural in that respect. Is that defined enough?
Okay.
Yeah.
Third principle would be it'd be wrong if it were unhealthy. That is like a harmful thing.
Okay.
And then 4 would be it would be wrong if it were unkind. And so those 4 principles is what he kind of used to filter through the different pieces.
And he seems to be going from severity down into the finer print, if you will, as to how to filter that. Okay.
So I'm curious your thoughts on those different 4 principles. So prohibited in the Bible, unnatural, unhealthy, and unkind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with those principles if you're approaching it from the standpoint of right or wrong.
Yes.
I think the way that kind of I've thought about this as we were kind of moving towards this panel is I would also have 4 principles, but they're probably a little different. And I think because I think the Bible, other than there are certain things that are prohibited, and I certainly appreciate that aspect of those principles, but the Bible doesn't kind of give you much detail on what you can and can't do in the context of sexuality within marriage. So the question is, to me, what kind of principles would help you navigate through those kinds of questions? And those are great, but some other ones, the ones that I would thought of is number 1 would be just that principle of, is this a reflection of self-giving love? Am I seeking to do this in a way that would cultivate that oneness, that unity, and for the good of the other person? And 1 Corinthians 13 talks a lot about what love looks like. Love is patient and kind, so there's that principle. It doesn't seek its own. So, second one to me would be avoid taking this gift and letting it gravitate into lust. Because we can take sexuality within marriage and turn it into a lust thing where it comes about fulfilling my self-gratification. And so that would be number 2. Number 3 would be don't entice or cause someone to violate their conscience. If someone's not comfortable, don't, because you're causing them to sin. And if there's a conscience issue and how you're trying to fulfill your sexuality in marriage.
I think that's where Piper put that into the unkind category. But yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And then the last one I would say is don't bring someone else into your sexual relationship. And this is where the pornography, fantasies and things like that, you're violating the intent of that sexuality. I think Hebrews 13:4 speaks kind of to this. It says, let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge. And he says the sexually immoral and adulterers. So there's two categories there. And you know what the word for sexual immorality is there? It's porneia. Sound familiar? Porn.
Yeah.
So I think the implication is if we use pornography to cultivate our marriage relationship, in a sense, we're bringing someone else, whether it's real or, imaginary, into that oneness that's supposed to be created. So I think those are kind of four principles that I would think to help kind of guide through how you navigate this.
Well, I think the tricky aspect of so much of this too is not necessarily tricky, but like so much of it involves your heart, where your heart's at in these different pieces too, to where like part of it is looking at, okay, why did you desire those things, and looking at the heart there, and then looking at the conversation with the spouse and the comfortability of different pieces, like things like that type of things. It creates different elements there that aren't necessarily just black and white on paper, every single one is right, wrong, etc. It creates nuances and trickiness that have to have sorted out in conversation.
Yeah, and the other reality is that I think we need to be really cognizant and gentle in our thought towards, is that because our sexuality is so tied in with the rest of our being, a lot of things can affect and damage that. Rape, abuse, other experiences growing up. And there can be some real challenges in trying to work through things to press towards a healthy, sexuality and marriage. And those are real struggles and challenges that can be difficult.
Okay. All right. Well, considering the principles that have all been laid out, do you have any principles you would like to lay out as well? Since we've heard
I was going to kind of like an observation here is that what we're doing, and whether it's Piper's list or Don's list, is that it's clear, it's obvious right off the bat, and when as soon as we start getting into some specifics, you'll see that there's very little specifics in the Bible of, okay, like these three positions are okay and this one's not. Like, it's like the Bible doesn't do that. Yeah. And so what we have to do instead is say, okay, what are the clear commands and what are the clear principles? And as it moves into realm of application, that does get muddy. Like right now, we're in we've been doing in that series, Romans 14 and 15, and that area of conviction of how to apply God's commands. People can arrive at different places on that. Yeah. And that might be okay, because like even that of like what's unhealthy and unkind might be different for different people, depending on background and experience and how you're communicating this. Yeah. So
that's where, like you said, think about Romans 14. This is where we can hold things loosely, and it's not a command: have to this, have to that, don't do this, don't do that. It is able to have different opinions and be okay with each other.
So hopefully, what we're modeling in this conversation is less, here are the top 10 things to do in the bedroom. And more a way of how to think biblically about things that the Bible is not clear about.
Right. So we're basically, if we were going to summarize it, we're about to give you some thoughts on how to walk away and consider some things. That's really kind of, if we were going to sum it up.
We're trying to give you a toolkit to think about this and go talk to your spouse.
Because the reality is, when the Bible doesn't say do this or don't do that, we're left to try to take biblical principles that the Bible does give us and say, how do they apply to this situation?
And that's what we do for other areas that lack that kind of crisp clarity as well. So this isn't like, we're just trying to do this because it's sex and we're trying to put limits on it. This is literally what we do with all the other stuff that's in these types of vague spaces as well.
Yeah, so maybe the difference between our two lists of principles is Piper is doing that specifically regarding the area of sexuality. I'm sort of taking a broader list of biblical principles and that say, how can we navigate through sorting through within that? Right. what's contributing to this oneness we're pursuing.
Yeah, okay. So basically you could probably use both lists. All of those questions to consider are extremely valid and I think biblically based principles to apply as we move forward.
And maybe we can kind of refer to those as we're trying to apply to some of these questions.
All right. So we'll go back to my starting question, then we'll go back to that now that we've hashed all that out, and then we'll start with some of the things that fall under this question, the kind of like bullet point things. So the question is all sexual activity in marriage okay, or are there still things that are off limits? So the first subheader to that is, are there types or styles of sex that are unbiblical or evil, such as oral or anal sex? Where can you look in the Bible for this?
Told you we were getting real, right?
Yep. I mean, you were warned. So here we are. We have arrived. So who wants to?
Who wants to start that one?
Don't all jump in at once.
Well, I think, first of all, because so these are all questions that kind of that you've gotten, and I think when you said, are there types or styles of sex that are unbiblical or evil, I think I'd be really careful in using that. It's not evil unless God says, thou shalt not do this. And so things like oral or anal sex, I don't know if we have a thou shalt not.
Right.
And so what we have are principles to try to apply here. And so the main principle that I use to try to think of this is, okay, what does self-giving love look like? And so I guess that there's probably lots of pieces of that, like you mentioned, of like communication and like what is communication and kindness and things like history and past experiences and all of that with a particular couple could be wrapped up in what does self-giving love look like here. So I guess so. My answer, if you're looking for like an answer, is oral and anal sex. I don't think is necessarily just forbidden. I think it still is. You're taking that same principle, and husband and wife talk about this and evaluate, why do you want this?
Well, maybe let me back up for a second. Maybe I can ask some other questions that go with this that might help. First part might be, because I'm just thinking of what might be behind this. Are these styles of sex considered biblical distortions, maybe from God's intended design for sex? Because you were talking about, sexual organs and the way that they're meant to fit together. That is in a specific context, if you will.
I'm pondering that a little, because so Piper's category there of unnatural I'm curious.
And that's what he did a good job breaking that down, I thought. And he was specifically addressing oral sex because he was talking about things like Song of Solomon. There's different pieces in there that
I was going to say,
that seem to allude to more than just sexual intercourse in its most basic form, to where he was saying, like, it seems like there's pieces in Song of Solomon that would allude to
a more immersive experience, if you will.
And
I mean, without
getting
getting graphic.
piece of intimacy. And so
it's more bodily involved than just.
So I would even think about that. For me, I would break those two acts into two different pieces, to where I would look at the anal sex piece. I would fall that into the unhealthy piece, because I think there's different aspects that pose much more serious medical risks than other forms of sex. And so that's where I think I would categorize it there. And so again, this is my own conviction in that piece. Versus oral sex, I think that there is, like I said, maybe some alludings to that in potentially verses in Song of Solomon. But I think for me, so much of that one comes back to the heart of why, the desires and the heart piece that is it actually self-giving, or is it just self-gratification? And that's where I think that's the conversation I wouldn't say it's yes or no, but it's a conversation that has to take place with the couple, and both sides have to be on the same page with that, because otherwise it is too prone to fall into categories there that isn't helpful.
Of course, every sexual expression and position and whatever can be the same thing.
100%.
But I think it's an opportunity if you're talking like, your husband and wife talking about, all right, how are we going to spice things up in the bedroom or whatever, or any other thing. I think it's an opportunity to bring that question to bear of what would self-giving look like here.
Other thoughts? Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know that I have too much to add to that. I would go back to those same 4 principles that I shared earlier. Am I doing this out of a self-giving love for the good of the other person? Has it become something that is now more about my gratifying my desires in a way that's more lustful than love? Is there a conscience issue here, on one side or the other?
Because that right there, like if one person's not comfortable with it, that seems like really clear right off the bat, then no.
And, so I think those are the things I try to navigate. And different couples may kind of think through those things differently.
Okay. All right, moving on to the next subheader. Are things like role-playing bad for building intimacy since you're not entering into sex as yourself or with your spouse as themselves?
I'm probably going to just start sounding like a broken record, but I think the same principles
that apply here.
No, that's fine. If that's the answer, then that's the answer.
Is this cultivating that oneness and intimacy that is more than just physical? Because I think the mistake sometimes that people make, and I think you alluded to this earlier because this is just the culture's way of relating to this area, is it's our sexuality in marriage it's just not just about the physical. It's about a relational oneness that our sexuality is a means to help us, cultivate and grow in. And so anything that doesn't kind of contribute to that and turns that into something else, I think we miss the point a little bit.
Yeah, I will ask for this question because I'm thinking about it as you're answering. Is maybe the real question here is there a danger or a risk that's being taken in doing role playing? I think that's more.
And I wonder if that's maybe a good way to
the heart of this
approach
question.
some of these because
what's the risk here?
Yeah,
when I talked earlier about what you get and what
here.
you might be sacrificing. It's obviously not always going to be if you do this, you sacrifice this, but it may be the potential to sacrifice something. So maybe like the possibility of pros and cons.
Like you were saying, I think there's perhaps when we're starting to talk about some other things like oral sex, there's a particular danger in that this can often be approached in a way that's not about self-giving love. Perhaps when we're talking like role-playing or something, that there's perhaps a danger here that this is not actually building intimacy.
It may be building a false intimacy with someone who isn't really your spouse.
Yeah, and I'm not saying as we say these possibilities, I'm not saying this will happen if you do these things. We're not saying that. We're talking about if there was a risk, if we were going to play this out, like how this might go, this is something that might arise as a possibility that maybe if you're going to do that, you want to be careful.
If that's the risk, then that's what's to be aware of and to communicate openly with your spouse about.
Yeah, and in my thinking, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, my first thought to this question would be, well, if it's about intimacy, then why would you want to pretend you're not with the person you're actually with? I don't know. And maybe that's a valid question. Maybe it's not. But I don't know. If it were me and someone said, I want to pretend you're not you, I'm kind of going, what? Why? I don't know. It's a question I'd want to know the answer to.
I wonder, because to me, I think part of this might relate to what's the goal here?
Yeah.
Is the goal just sexual pleasure? Because if that's your goal, then, what's the difference in that goal with other, immorality, with adultery? There's no difference in the goal and those things. So marriage, the marriage relationship is the sexuality has a different goal, a different purpose. And you don't want to lose sight of that goal is that, self-giving, relational oneness. And if you don't have that as the goal, then you may not make the best decisions as to what's okay to do.
Yeah.
Well, I think when I think about especially this question and the one you'll get to next, I'm going to sound like a rock record on this one. So much of it to me is the heart of why. Like, check your own heart, check your desires. Are you just wanting to do these things because what you've seen in pornography, this must be the way to do it?
Yeah.
That's you're getting your information from a poor source.
Yeah.
And so that in that respect, I think it can be really, it's really ultimately maybe even fueling bad things in your own heart in that process without even necessarily fully realizing it. And I think oftentimes, I'm not going to say a blanket statement forever, but oftentimes it's coming from this place of having viewed things in that area, and therefore this must be the way to do it. That's just not a good, healthy
really
mindset.
Good point. Yeah. Now on the flip side, because I'm just trying to think through that, I could see. Because again, I don't think we want to give the impression that, oh yeah, there's a lot, I don't know about that. Because I could see, in the same way of couples going and doing some fun thing, playing a game together as an experience that builds intimacy. Like, okay, maybe that this could be that. But I think that's some really good questions.
Yeah,
to
and that's where it
analyze.
has to look back at the heart, because I think that it's not a blanket statement, yes or no. There's liberty and love together, but the reality is checking your heart, checking the desires, checking those things are so vital in these pieces.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's always about, like, is it just sinful, or am I sinning if I'm wanting this or not wanting this? I think what we talked about earlier about, like, the three components that are kind of what make this the spiritual, the emotional, and the physical. I think if you're going to ask yourself, what do I gain by doing this, and what might I jeopardize? I think it might be helpful to ask that for all three of those components. Because the only thing that's coming up in my brain as maybe you might want to think about it, is if this builds an emotional connection or a physical connection, or in some way dampens what feels like your spiritual connection with that particular person, your spouse, because it feels like you're starting to build it with something that's not real, maybe you might want to consider the impact that might have on you and also the other person. I'm not saying what it would be, but I think that's a question you might want to ask. And also trust, because I think for the intimacy part, I would think in this area of your life, you would not want to do something that would jeopardize the trust that you have in each other. So if for some reason, even if it didn't foster mistrust in you, if it might in the other person, I don't know if I would want to do that if that affected them like that.
That's why communication and conscience things are important.
And honesty for that. Because if you're that person, you need to say it.
Yeah, both this and the following question, I think the caution would be it's very easy to depersonalize and even dehumanize in a way that isn't building intimacy.
Yeah.
And that's where it's, I think, extremely dangerous in that respect.
Yeah.
But again, it's ongoing conversation with the spouse, between the spouses, because it may be something where maybe at one point you're like, okay, we want to try this. And then afterwards, have the conversation again. Is this still something we want to include at any point? You both have the freedom to say, you know what, that's not good. We got to stop that. Yeah. It's having that ongoing conversations and communication and trust with one another to know that it can't just be one way of forcing. It has to be a mutual consent in that process together.
And to keep doing that too, because I would imagine you might be able to do something at one point in your marriage that doesn't affect you, but maybe later, based off of where somebody is, it might hit you differently. And maybe you would want to change something at that point. So since we're not saying like blanket right or wrong, or this is what will happen if this is what you do, I think that it's probably, unless someone has other thoughts, I feel like that's fairly, there are things to just think about if that's something that you're considering. Next one is, if both people are into sex practices like S&M, sex toys, sexy lingerie, porn, or adding another person, are they okay to do together if it makes you want your spouse more for sex? So keeping in mind, all of the items that are in that list may not actually be addressed in the same way. They may actually need to be parsed out and categorized a little bit differently, but that's the list that we have.
Yeah, this is a question somebody had, but I think I would think about the things in that list very differently, but applying these principles, because you say, okay, does God's word forbid it right off the bat, that adding another person? It doesn't matter if both of you are okay with that. It's not okay. So just no. God says no. It's not. It's like husband and wife might both give consent, but God doesn't. So
that's where pornography would fall in the same category.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now the other things, S&M, that's kind of like the bondage stuff like that. Hard to, I guess it's hard for me to see how that could fit into a framework of mutual self-giving love.
I would very much look at that with the unkind and borderline unhealthy, especially mentally unhealthy in terms of like dehumanizing another person in that process.
Yeah, I was going to say, because someone who's into that, if you were to listen to anyone that would practice such a thing, I think they would tell you that for them, that is the emotional connection. It is for them seen as a positive. But just because it's seen as a positive by them doesn't necessarily mean that it is a positive thing. So that becomes the question.
And so I guess my follow-up questions to that, if someone was to say that, of this, like, this is enjoyable to me, this is how, like, I guess my follow-up questions to that would be why, and perhaps there might be some reason that it's okay, but I feel like that also raises a lot of red flags of why does someone treating you like this, like why does that turn you on, or why does that make you happy, like what do you believe about yourself, and again maybe there's nothing there, but there's sure some red flags I'd like to talk about.
Yeah, because it is a question, is it unnatural to perceive pain as pleasure? And I think that's probably a valid question. I mean, you could go a scientific route with that, you could go a spiritual route without, whichever way. But
it seems difficult to fit that into 1 Corinthians 13.
Yeah.
Love is patient, love is kind.
You know what I mean? And again, sexuality is an important part of kind of our design as human beings, and there can be a brokenness that affects it, in many different ways for many different reasons. And sometimes I would wonder if things like that aren't more the result of some kind of brokenness in us, in our humanity, that is being manifested that way.
Yeah. And that we also live in a culture where you're told if someone tells you this is how you best love me, this is what I perceive, that the culture would tell you that is love to them and that's how you need to love them. And this would be a case where I think the Bible might say something a little bit different. It kind of speaks to its own definition of love regardless of how other people tell you to love them.
Just because this comes natural, like let's say comes naturally to you, does not necessarily mean it's good. Just because it's and this is, I know Piper means this, but I want to make sure that we're using the words correctly, because our culture says if it's a natural default desire, it is therefore good.
Okay.
If you, I'm on the right track, baby. I was born this way.
Yeah.
And I think the Bible is just flat no. A lot of times our desires are manifestations of brokenness and not just a good natural default thing. And so one of the things if you're bringing broken desires into marriage, one of the things I think that God wants for your marriage is to use your marriage to start healing some of that brokenness, not to just say, hey, this is who I am, this is good.
Well, I would tend to think that, especially in that world of SM type stuff, those don't just pop in your head as natural things. You probably got it from somewhere. And so checking your heart in those things would be, I think, very crucial, because you're probably doing it from unnatural desires in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it should be probably mentioned here that sexuality is an area where bondage can become very much a real thing, in a variety of different ways.
Are you talking about like spiritual bondage?
Spiritual
Yeah, we should probably clarify.
Bondage in a biblical sense, where you're caught in something and you really are having a difficult time kind of breaking free of that. And sometimes some of the different aspects of our brokenness can become things that are very difficult to kind of, figure out how to get out of. But something else on your list there, the lingerie, I think that's perfectly fine if done, in the context of wanting to cultivate that sexual intimacy and oneness. I wouldn't.
I actually have a question for you, because you've mentioned a couple times like the concept of lust in marriage.
Yeah, this is where I was going to go with
No,
this,
you're
because I'm
good.
like, it's the only reason I can envision that this could possibly be in this list. So yeah.
And so maybe you can flesh this out a little bit, because I think you defined lust as what, sexual, like about self-gratification. Now, at the same time, I think it's clear, especially in places like Song of Solomon again, that sexual desire in marriage is a good thing. And so how would you parse out?
Yeah, how do you cultivate then like sexual desire in your spouse without cultivating lust in them or
There it is,
provoking
yeah.
them to that? Is that what you're going for? Because that's the
Yes.
only thing I could think of why this would be on this
I think
page.
that's a great question. I guess the way that I would think about it is desire. There's nothing wrong with sexual desire. There's nothing wrong with desire biblically. But when desire morphs into something that becomes a selfish, self-focused, commitment to the fulfillment of that at the expense of others' good, it's all about me at this point, and it's not a self-giving expression of love. Well, I think that's what the Bible defines as lust. It's when we're taking something intended to be a good desire, and we're turning it into something that becomes almost an idolatrous serving of self.
And so, yeah.
But how do you parse out the provoking of that? Like, because if you're talking about something like lingerie, stirring up desires in somebody, then how would you, I guess, know, or what makes that different as to how do you know what you've actually stirred up? Like, how do you know that you're not just stirred? Do you know what I don't know if I'm asking this properly, but
I understand exactly.
Is it less to do with this and more to do with the heart of the person who's being provoked? Is that kind of, and it just comes down to that?
I think you have to really be wrestling with evaluating your heart,
Okay.
because I think it's very easy to slip into the deception of desire turning into lust, and in many different areas of life. It can be money, it can be, it can be power, it can be status, it can be other people's approval, all of which are legitimate kind of desires. But if the heart kind of goes after them in a way to make them a very self-centered, almost idolatrous thing, well, then it's become something else.
So it's kind of like if something makes you want your spouse, that's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's
Not
not
at all.
bad to be wanted by your spouse to do things that would encourage
I would
that.
say it more strongly. I think
Okay.
wanting your spouse and things that cultivate desire, like one spouse for another, are actually a good thing.
Okay.
Just again, open and honest communication about this. That I think. So this particular question, lingerie and stuff, as an expression of one spouse delighting in giving themselves to another spouse, awesome. But yeah, it's just.
But if demanded upon, then it becomes an unloving thing.
that what?
If it's demanded rather than giving, then it becomes an unloving
demanded things like.
Yep.
Or if
Yeah,
it's,
and then it's
I don't
become
want to say
about-
consumption-based,
Exactly.
if that's a horrible way to put it, but
Yep.
Yeah.
I think the lust thing for me, my brain always says, you're consuming another person, at their own expense. You're just kind of
Yeah, I think
devouring
that's
them.
the phrase it was coming at their expense in some way. It's not for their good
Okay.
anymore.
Okay. All right. So something, I guess that really has to be tested within the marriage and within the individual then for that particular one to play out as to how
but-
that's
So
going.
again, like all of these, some questions, some tests, cautions, but I do think of that list, a lot of the things on the list are like no, but that one I think can play a role in that the genuine and good cultivation of desire in a
Okay.
marriage.
all right.
So I guess the one on the list we didn't talk about so far was sex toys. So the question is
I didn't
that
see
one.
that one.
'Cause that to me is, I think, the grayest area of them all.
The greatest of them all. Okay.
Yeah,
No other thoughts? Just the greatest of them all.
Yeah.
I guess, and again, there's maybe a diversity of what's included in there.
Yeah.
But Yeah, I don't know. I'd probably go back to the principles we've been talking about and try to evaluate.
And what were those again, Don? No.
No. Well, the ones that I'm thinking of if I'm thinking like questions, you're talking about, mutual consent. Do both people want this? Is that something that they're both wanting to move into? You're both comfortable. It's giving. It's not just selfish.
Yeah.
But also maybe.
And the building intimacy.
I was going to say, let's go into what's at
one.
risk here, because that would be more the
Yeah.
question I would ask for this. Is there something that has the potential to be at stake if we go in the three pillars, if you will, that we've discussed as to what makes this what God has designed? Is there something where it might lean into putting something in jeopardy to think about?
There might be another question, because sometimes maybe there are other questions that aren't necessarily sexual that need to be asked. In other words, in your marriage, is there anything affecting your relationship that would hinder the expression of it in your sexuality with one another, such that that's not something that you're finding you're easily able to do without something else to help that?
So something in this way that might break the intimacy.
Yeah, is there an emotional intimacy problem in our relationship? Is there a spiritual intimacy problem? Is there a relational intimacy?
So you're kind of saying, like, if this question is like need this to help with arousal and desire, is that indicative of there's another problem?
Something else going on that
And again,
might
that's
be
a question. You're not saying like factually, but you're
question.
just saying that's a question that might be worth discussing.
And that's where I would go back to what we talked about a couple times, like, okay, the why, what is the desire there in the first place? Are you just doing it because of things you've seen, whatever else, that maybe isn't as healthy as example? And I mean, the reality of our culture today, because of the epidemic of porn usage, things like erectile dysfunction are way more popular now. And so it may be like, I need it because I can't. And it's like, okay, then there's other issues behind the scenes here you got to deal with.
Yeah, and I was going to say for the other two, because we sort of touched on, but not really, the porn one and adding another person in some way, the sex toy one in my brain might also have this question with those two. I go back to the trust thing, because I'm thinking if it's not just about what I'm comfortable with, it's also about that person being comfortable in this intimacy and them trusting me and me trusting them. If any of those things, and there's other things that could be said about some of these too, but if any of those things would cause someone to question my commitment to them, or my connection with them, or my trust in them, where they can trust me that I'm not going somewhere else, I would think that would jeopardize the intimacy portion of this, and maybe even the spiritual component as well for that relationship. Because I would think if there's anything, and I'm just blanket statementing this, if there were anything that made you kind of go through your spouse as opposed to your spouse to be satisfied and fulfilled in this area, that could risk something there. Because that doesn't, in my thinking, that doesn't sound quite right, but I mean, please comment if that's not correct. But
Yeah. Well, I was going to bring in another.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Another thought, because one other thing, and we touched on this earlier, but if you're trying to discern whether things like this are good and healthy for your, marriage and sexuality in your relationship, one of the things that I think is characteristic of things that are being motivated more by lust is that lust generally creates the bondage we were talking about earlier. So if love is more, there's a freedom in love. We're free to experience this together, but we don't need something in order to be able to do that. So if you need something in order to be able to experience, then that may be an indication that is there something there that is almost creating a little bit of a bondage that's got you caught there that you can't do without this.
That's a really good principle far beyond the area of sex.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and obviously the caution in my mind in that world is just the reality of it. I think it can very easily reinforce a predisposition of dehumanizing or depersonalizing. And so the caution there at least is, continually talk about those type of pieces, because if it's leading to those things, that's not healthy and good.
Yeah, I mean, is it fair to say, like, and I'm speculating here again, I'm thinking on the fly, but if God designed this for people to have, then logically I would deduce that everything that you should need for it to be full should already be able to be there in the way that he's designed it for the two people that are involved in this. Now, my only caveat to that would be physical or health related things that may interfere just in a broken world that may make things more difficult. But apart from that, is it fair to say that you should be able to be full in this intimacy without all the other things?
I would say
or is that going too far?
Theoretically.
Okay.
And the reason I would say theoretically is because of the reality of the fallenness and brokenness of the world we live in, and the damage that can often be done to people in various ways growing up, and that might make the fulfillment of that in reality a challenging thing. And you would hope that by God's grace, that there would be a growing and a healing and a progressing towards that.
Well, let me clarify my question, if I can, just real quick. So what I mean by that is, like, if you go back to the beginning of God's design for this, if we go back to Adam and Eve, most of this stuff was not in play. Now, obviously,
they didn't have sex toys. They
right.
didn't need sex toys.
That's what I'm saying. There wasn't any porn. There wasn't any of this stuff. So if you're talking about things that I'm going to call like sex aids, if that's what we're talking about here, then by design, outside of a fallen world, those things are not, I would say they don't appear to be necessary for you to be full. Because I would imagine that God designed this to be full and satisfying as he made it without those things. Is that fair to conclude?
I see what you're saying. Yeah,
okay.
I think that's
So I'm not saying that because
fair.
we're in a broken world that means all of this is now necessary. Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying more, well, do you know what I'm saying? I just want to clarify
I'm not saying
that.
it's necessary. I think what I was saying is in the experience of the fullness of the reality as God intended it, the brokenness of this world often can interfere with that and cause challenges for people to experience that.
Yes.
So in the design, it's not that those things would be necessary, but
I'm trying to see what people can strive for here. Because if someone goes, well, it's a broken world, man, that's gone, that's dead and gone, I can't aim for that, we need help.
Settle for
that's
those
different.
kinds of solutions, and that you should press for that relational and emotional intimacy. But I also want to be aware that for some people, that can be there can be some real challenges.
But I think we're talking about two different maybe heart orientations in that. Then no, I'm just saying I think there might be two different lines of thinking, because one is more, I believe that God's design for this may still be available to me as much as is possible, and I could aim for that and believe that I will be full and happy and satisfied in that if that's what we decide we want to do. Whereas the other is just saying, well, I'm looking at this, but recognizing that it may not be what it was designed to be in that, because we are in a broken world. But then it becomes a question of, I feel like that leans more towards asking, how much help do I need and how much help can I get to get where I want to be? And that's a different question.
Is this leading me into more intimacy with my spouse? I think that's kind of the fundamental question.
And I guess what I'm saying is I think that it would appear that the original promise and gift of what this is as sex for a married couple is a full gift and promise in the way that it seems to be presented. I don't believe that we've lost the ability to have that as people just because we're in a broken world. Would you
I just don't want to.
I'm just trying to make sure we're making the right point here.
I don't want to heap guilt on someone who, for whatever reason, really struggles, to experience this reality in their marriage and doesn't know exactly how to fix that.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? I just want to be careful that
I'm not saying that the stuff's wrong. We're not talking rights and wrongs. I'm saying if this is something you wanted to aim for, because I think there are people that might say, well, I would love to have that, but I just don't know that I believe that's possible for me. Do you know what I mean? So if you're that person, I want to give that person hope that is possible for them. I think that promise is still out there for them to be full. If you're wrestling with something because you're scared to let it go, that if I don't do this act or have this thing that helps me in this way, I won't be full and I'm scared to let that go because of that. I think that God could meet someone in that with the promise of what he already offers, how he designed this. I think that's the argument I'm making. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that God would say, I made you.
But I'm not saying that
this.
because you do any of these other things that necessarily makes you wrong for doing them. I'm making the argument, if you wanted to strive for something else, if you are wrestling with, I'd like to break away from this because maybe I'm not sure where I feel about this thing, I think that you could and still be full. That's my only argument.
I agree 100% with what you're saying.
If that makes
I'm
sense.
probably, in my comments, thinking more broadly
Yes.
about the challenges people can have in the area of sexuality,
Yeah,
not
I agree.
those specific things.
I just want to make sure we're making both points I think are valid. I just want to make sure we're not muddying the water. So, okay. All right. Are we ready to move on to other questions?
I think so, yeah.
I think so.
All right. Okay. So I am now going to read some questions that are not going to be read in my own voice because they are phrased as they are from another person. So I'm just letting you know that's how I'm going to read them, and I'm going to read them as they are written. So I am now impersonating a different person. Okay. So this is not me about to say this.
Voices?
Just want to clarify this. No. All right. So here's the question. I use porn because I can have a hard time feeling like my relationship meets all my physical needs by itself, and it helps us both get aroused when we are together. We see it more as a relationship aid. If we both are comfortable using it together to make our experience better, is it really wrong? The Bible doesn't mention things like porn or masturbation directly, so isn't this really just interpretation or opinion? Now, we've sort of touched on this, but I don't know if there's additional thoughts that someone would want to put towards this.
I think some things we've talked about of that, I think that the Bible is clear about bringing someone else into your marriage, whether that's in person or on a screen.
I was going to say, you are counting pornography as bringing someone else into your covenant sex relationship. Is that what you're... Okay.
And Jesus says if you look at a woman with lustful intent, you've committed adultery in your heart. So Jesus doesn't distinguish between someone being right in front of you and being on a screen.
Okay.
And so now another thing that kind of a red flag here was I have a hard time feeling like my relationship meets all my physical needs by itself. Mm-hmm. Sounds like they've got this backwards, that sex is not about self-gratification. Mm-hmm. Sex is about self-giving love. And so I think if you're coming at it from, I need this to meet my needs, then I can see where you end up here. John's here to change our batteries.
He's off screen.
Okay, never mind.
We're just doing a brief adjustment.
And you just brought attention to the didn't you?
Sorry. Sorry. Pay no attention to the man who's not on the screen. So right off the bat, I think if you flip this around and it's not about meeting my needs, mm-hmm. it's about giving myself to the other person. Right off you're coming from a completely different direction.
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
I think you think about things too, like with that, like to me that there might be something more you need to kind of dig into your own heart of the why. Like, is this you guys are seeking this here, but is there the pieces there where you're actually lusting after the person on the screen, not your actual spouse? Mm-hmm. And is there the history there of your own usage of porn that's causing these things need to be filled this way that isn't satisfied for your spouse? I think there's at least a caution there of digging into that a little more in your heart, of understanding what's going on, and reach out to a counselor, pastor, whatever, to talk through some of these pieces. So I think there's some, like you said, there's maybe some disordered loves in that process that need to be thought about.
Yeah, and I think it's worth considering if you're come back to this as well. I think I can keep myself in check while doing this. Like, I think that I would be able to keep everything in my heart in balance, and it will not make me want someone who isn't my spouse. I feel like that really just underestimates the power of the pull of things like this, and you assuming that you can maintain control over that desire and steer it the way that, because I think sometimes when it comes to desire stuff, people assume that they will just make choices. But in some ways, it seems like in real life, desire is a little bit different. It can be sort of steered, but it is a self-propelling boat, if that makes sense.
Desire steers you. I think people don't realize the extent.
Yeah, so like maybe you make choices as to where you're like, aiming the boat to move, if that makes sense, but you're not going to be able to stop the motion of the boat. Like the boat's moving. It's just a question of where it's going. So for you to assume like I will never start to inch a little to the left and then end up somewhere else seems very assuming of your heart that you will not
I think that's
deviate.
The two other pieces here I'd love to bring up. You brought up a little bit last week, and I'd love to expand on what you said last time, was talking about the porn industry and the evils of the industry. You talked a lot about, what was the things you brought up? You brought like the child human trafficking, things like that.
Yeah,
I think the other piece of that
porn is
as
a huge justice issue.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of that as well is one of the things you don't see often, but I've heard different pieces about is the things like drug usage and suicide rate is massive in the porn industry because especially the females feel so used. A lot of times there's drugs involved just to be able to do the acts they have to do. Yeah. And the suicide rate as a result of that is incredible. So in terms of justice issue, I'd lump that right in there too. But also it's an incredibly dark industry that needs Jesus, obviously.
Yeah, this is not something that we're just using porn and it's not hurting anybody. It is hurting people. It's hurting the person on the other side of the screen. It's contributing to an evil industry that has people in bondage.
And there's so much things involved like abuse and rape, whatever else in there. That
And that's
and
just
I think
what's
it's hurting
on
yourself
the
too.
screen. I think there's also a lot of damage that comes to the person who's watching. I mean, if we're talking about what's on the screen, it's kind of a perfect example of when you take the three pillars we're talking about, the physical, the spiritual, the emotional. If you break everything off and just make it physical, that's the breakdown that you're getting. And you can see kind of the destructiveness of that. So it's distortion to many extents.
I think the first question I would raise is, have you got the goal of this wrong? You know, have you settled for the goal of some sort of sexual gratification here at the expense of the emotional and relational oneness and intimacy with your spouse, which I just not sure how I would see that contributing to that. And the other principle, you know, that I would raise a question on is, what are you cultivating in this? Are you cultivating love? Or are you cultivating lust and confusing it as something that's helpful?
Yeah. Well, and I think the other piece that would be good to mention here too is the reality of things like pornography. It's very easily an addiction. There's things like the brain chemistry altered, et cetera, like that. It's an addiction. And so please hear from us that there's grace for you. You aren't trapped in the addiction. Yeah. There's freedom to be found, but you got to bring it to the light. You got to talk to other people about it because sin thrives in darkness. And so knowing the reality statistics-wise, there's probably a good chunk of people listening to this that have an addiction there that need help. Yeah. And they're too ashamed or afraid to admit it. Yeah. But please come talk to a counselor, a psychologist, a pastor, somebody. We'd love to help you find freedom in that area.
Yeah, and also I think a lot of people, they try to fight this kind of an addiction or this kind of a wrestling because they don't know how to get rid of some of the longings and desires that they do have that they're not confident are going to get filled if they walk away from this. And that's part of the pull that I think addiction really has on people. Yep. So please, in a lot of what we've already said, also hear us saying there is still a promise of a full sex life out there for that person, that if you are walking away from this, I think there is still something out there that's more whole than what you are currently experiencing and more dynamic for you that God has designed for you to have. So it's not just about what, you know, people want you to say no to. This is really about something else that we would really want you to be able to say yes to, that we believe is significantly better and fuller by a good and holy, generous God. So please, there's hope in that. I hope you can hear that from us.
I really like how you just said that like we have a generous God. We don't need to go outside of his will and do things that he says are wrong in order to give us something we think we need. We have a generous God.
Yeah, for you to live a good, full, happy life, you don't, the lie of the world is you have to deviate from his plan to get that. And I think this is one of those areas that's a common lie. I don't believe that's true because God's character doesn't break. So if he's good and he's generous and he designed us to be happy and to take good care of us. He's not trying to withhold good things from you. He wants you to have good things by his definition, which is more whole and more knowing than ours. And I think the culture has tried to redefine in this area what good is. And so if you believe that they're right, it's hard to argue with God on this. But he is more right than us. So
another piece to note here, too, that I'd love to bring up, too, is just the reality that increasingly over the past 10, 15 years, pornography is not just a guy issue.
No,
it is
not at all.
increasingly a female issue as well. Statistics would show that actually it's much closer to an even playing field than it's ever been before.
Yeah.
And so this isn't something that's just reserved for guys. This is a conversation that needs to be had with both.
Yeah.
And if you're a female struggling, you don't necessarily feel comfortable talking to one of us about it, there are tons of great resources and ministries out there that love to dive into this stuff.
And we have female counselors here at the church.
Yes,
if there's
exactly.
somebody you wanted to talk to here, there are definitely people
But
you
just
can
one
talk
plug,
to.
if you guys are having a struggle in this area, and you don't feel comfortable talking to us, check out the ministry, Pure Desire Ministries. They do fantastic things for both males and females in this area. And so please don't hesitate to seek out help in those areas.
Yeah, and if you are a woman that's wrestling with these things, this is not a conversation that we're just having thinking of men who are wrestling with all these things. This is definitely for everybody.
Yes.
If God designed everybody as sexual beings, and there's really no reason to say, oh, well, men more so. I think that's also a cultural lie to some extent, that sex is more for men and it's not for women. That's just not so.
Yeah.
So, okay. Other thoughts on that before we move on?
Well, so just, real quick, because there was one other piece of this that they said at the end, that the Bible doesn't mention things like porn or masturbation directly, so isn't this really just interpretation and opinion? And to that, I'll just refer to what we kind of said earlier, that what we're trying to do here is taking what is clear in Scripture and principles and applying it. So there are areas that are conviction, but we also have to recognize that there are things that are clear. Not bringing someone else into your marriage bed. When you look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery.
Yeah.
And that, I think, just because you don't call it pornography, it's still pornography. And so the question that this person is raising is clear, but the way that we're approaching this with all these other questions, I think, is my answer to their last point.
And I hate to have to include this, but I may. We're not just counting pornography as something that is recorded. I know that sounds strange that I might have to say that, but if you are in the presence of something where you are also watching something, I feel like we also need to include that also counts in this. Would you guys agree with that, or are you not counting that?
I guess, what do you mean by that?
If there is sexual activity happening in your presence that you are not a part of, but you are watching.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify that it doesn't have to be recorded for this to count.
Sure,
I hate that I have to say it, but we're going to say it just to be safe. Okay, go ahead.
The only other thought maybe I would have in this area for someone to think about, if this is kind of where you're at, is if watching porn, which I think it would be fair to say doesn't cultivate the kind of relational, intimacy of love that sex was designed for, that it's cultivating probably more of a lustful kind of stimulation. The question I would raise is, what are you then transferring over when you begin to engage with your spouse?
That's a good
because if you think you're going to just flip the switch, from
to transfer that feeling to that person
to a self-giving love, I think you're probably deceiving yourself a little bit.
Yeah.
And I would even, you talked about watching or witnessing. I think the other piece there that oftentimes people maybe have, it's more borderline, people consider like, oh, this isn't a big deal. It can be even considered things like Where Your Heart and things like certain romance novels that are more graphic in the language they're using. Checking your heart in some of those and your mind in those, because it may not be something you're seeing, but it could be doing the same thing mentally in your brain that watching
and
it would be.
your movies and your TV shows,
Yes.
and maybe potentially even your music, depending on how that affects you and what's being discussed in that music. If it's stuff that's all kind of churning up the same kinds of things that watching a porn video that's labeled as a porn video is, it's probably still worth considering.
Exactly.
If it, that's a good point. Good point.
Another piece here that brought up was the idea of masturbation stuff, and so
Yes,
I would
that's true.
argue oftentimes in that it's you're skewing it to self-satisfaction rather than self-giving.
And also, I would question for that one if that is also a trust issue. Depending on the circumstance, I'm not determining that that's what it is for somebody. But if you can't trust or open up to let somebody else be a part of making you happy in this area where you want to take care of that on your own, I have questions about that. I'm not saying I can put answers on
I
it,
think that's,
but that is a question that I would have, because I'm going, if this is supposed to be something where you have to also in the part of the intimate relationship, I'm thinking, is not just you intimately loving, but also you allowing someone into your intimate space to let them love you in that way. And that's deeper than just physical. So if you, for some reason, can't do that, or you're unwilling to do that, then I feel like you're holding back on a piece of what this is meant to be for you, but I would want to know why. I just feel like that's a question I would have to ask either myself or the other person. Like, why is it that you can't let somebody else in that space? Why do you have to do that?
And the other thing I might say about masturbation is, again, I think we talked about this last time when we were talking about singleness, but the gift of sex has a context, you know, and a purpose, and that purpose is in that pursuit of oneness in a marriage relationship. So when you take the gift and use it out of the context, you're normally distorting that in a way that's not ultimately for your good. And again, one of the clues that that this isn't cultivating God's desire in the area of sex is, does it become a bondage? You know, and masturbation often does.
Yeah. Now, the only argument that I've heard for this one, and I'm not trying to defend it, I'm just saying this is the argument I've heard that might be a rebuttal, is if you're in a marriage relationship, but you're often not in the same place, so someone's traveling a lot, either for work or other things like that. This
I
is
had a
often,
conversation with a guy, exactly that question, where
the context where it comes up.
Is it wrong if I am masturbating but only think about my wife?
Yeah.
Or two, if I'm traveling for work and we're even like
right.
sexting pictures back and forth.
Right.
Is it an issue?
Because we can't physically be
together. I'm curious how you guys answer that question with a guy.
Yeah.
I had that exact conversation with a guy a few years ago. He's like, I'm traveling for work.
Yeah.
My
Someone
wife
would
and I text
argue
back
if I
pictures
can't have more, and this is the most that I can have because I'm not physically there, this is me trying to cultivate something with my spouse. So if someone's making that argument, what would be your comeback to that?
I'm curious how you guys would answer that question.
I know.
I guess I think that opens up a whole other, like, there could possibly be lots of variations on that question, lots of different circumstances. And so I think I would just go back to, again, of saying, is this cultivating intimacy with your spouse? And so are there situations that, like, maybe it could be, I guess, but I guess that's the question.
Yeah, that is the question. So I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe instead of approaching what it's building, is it jeopardizing? Maybe we have to look at it from both angles, because it's not just about what does it cultivate naturally. It's, does this put anything within those three pillars that we're saying is part of the design of this? Does it jeopardize potentially any of those three?
And that's where I went back to, is just the reality of, like, is it really about your wife then? Or is it about you satisfying your needs? And that's where I would call it a question of, like, I think the heart is off here, to where I think it's more about you than about your spouse at that point.
At least,
and you're
at least possibly.
I find it hard to believe it wouldn't be, but to me, it's like, in essence, what you're doing is you're using your spouse for your own satisfaction.
And that could still be true for both of you.
Yes.
Just because these things don't always have to go right because one person's in a certain way. Just because you agree doesn't always necessarily mean that you're both coming at it from a good place. So it could be you're both doing that, and you're both saying, I'm willing to use the other person. But then I'm asking, well, what are you cultivating there?
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, and I wonder sometimes if this isn't a reflection of a lack of trust in God's grace. You know, if I'm away from my wife, is there grace for me? You know, in that situation, there certainly seems to be in 1 Corinthians 7 that you can separate for a time, you know, of prayer. You know, in Matthew 19, Jesus talks about, you know, after he talks about marriage and the disciples are saying, boy, you know, who would be married if the only reason you get a divorce is because of sexual adultery or immorality? And Jesus says, well, you know, not everyone can receive this. And he talks about eunuchs, you know, that they're, so how some people are made eunuchs, some people are born from birth, and some people choose to become. And so if I just translate eunuch to someone who isn't sexually active, your sexuality isn't the end all of everything. There is a grace for God, just like there is for single people.
Yeah.
I think for married people, to allow you to kind of walk in these things in a healthy way.
Yeah.
And you don't, are we trusting in that grace in those situations? Or are we trying to turn that into something that becomes self-gratifying, in a way that may not be building that relational intimacy?
Okay. Other thoughts, or can I move on? Good? All right. Next question. Are there good things that turn people on and also bad things that shouldn't? Are sexual fetishes unbiblical in some way? Are they a perversion of something in God's design for humans and sex, or are they natural and acceptable?
Well, let's define sexual fetish. So to me, my understanding of what that would be is where you have some sort of sexual connection or attachment or stimulation to an object that is not sexual.
Object, visual.
Could be a foot.
Whatever. Could be someone dressed as an animal. I don't know.
Could be a shoe.
Yeah. Or certain situations, too. I think that would also count in there. Situations, certain visual stimulus, and maybe objects.
It would certainly seem like those things are taking sex out of the context of God's design for it. It would be hard for me to argue that that's a legitimate part of God's design for our sexuality.
Yeah, and I think so, and maybe to clarify, because some of these probably depend on how you're meaning the term.
Yeah,
like this is not saying that like.
Some people say like they have a foot fetish. So I'm like, if you like feet, is that wrong, or is that really in the same category as what he just described?
You're allowed to be attracted to your wife's feet.
Yeah, I don't know if that's quite in the same category.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't want to exclude that.
No, I'm just saying there's different ways people generically use that kind of a term. So your definition is helpful, but there's also some other stuff maybe in another category that maybe we're not including under that definition.
I think generally speaking, I think you're probably right that I think sexual desire, when directed at things outside of God's design for sexual desire, that I think that's probably an indication of brokenness. Something has gone wrong in our desires.
Are there questions for someone to ask themselves to evaluate that might help you figure that out? Like, is there a way to sort that through to figure out like what's really going on there? Because this
what is
true,
the question that goes from like, okay, I'm attracted to my wife, and think about Song of Solomon, and like different parts of your spouse's body attracts you. Where does it become your heart's gone too far, and how do you discern that?
Yeah, I mean, does the attractiveness to another person's body in your marriage relationship count as how we're defining a fetish really right now is probably the first question. Because if we're not including that, then we would have to only be addressing like the things that he categorized, which may change the answer here.
It wouldn't be in the definition that I wouldn't be including your attraction to parts of your wife's body. That would be within, I don't know, this is a broad term, in the realm of a healthy attractiveness.
And even, would that include people that are just attracted to different features of people in general, but also applies to your spouse?
There's a spectrum here of saying that certain features I find attractive, and then there's certain features that maybe are a little stranger, like feet or something, to more of I think the way that you gave the definition of things that are kind of outside of the realm of sexuality and yet provoke a sexual desire.
Because this kind of feels like we're coming back to the question that you had from Piper, that is it natural? That almost feels like
because to me, when I think of what a fetish is, it's that I'm looking at some non-sexual object as the source of my sexual gratification. So it's not just that I'm attracted to my wife's feet or whatever as part of our, relationship in that arena, but this has now become how I find my gratification in that object. It is my sexual gratification. That's where I think it's outside the realm of kind of God's design.
Okay. All right. Good to move on? All right. Can you have a successful marriage if sex isn't really a part of it? What about those who aren't able to have sex due to medical or physical reasons? Will their marriage fall apart or their spouse be tempted to cheat or leave because they can't have sex? Is masturbation okay in this context? I know we already sort of touched on that, so if you don't feel the need to add to that for the masturbation portion, then just answer the rest.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question, and it's the different areas of that of aren't able to because of medical or physical things, and I think I guess part of my answer to that is like you said, I do think that God has grace here, and that He wants that if there's something else like that going on, that God has grace for you to persevere and to love your spouse and be united to your spouse. That just because something is broken does not mean that God can't do anything with it.
Because the heart of this question to me sounds like, can I still have a full marriage if for some reason sex can't be a part of it? It almost sounds like, am I failing my spouse in a way where they will not be able to stay or stick with me?
And that's where I look at that first question, can you have a successful marriage? I would argue yes, because you can develop intimacy in more ways than just sex.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, there's grace for individuals in that process, simply put.
Yeah, and if the way we've defined marriage as a covenant of companionship, if that's the real objective of it, and sexuality is a part of that, but it's not the totality of that. And you can still have and enjoy and have that covenant of companionship in a very meaningful way. Now that doesn't mean that that's not a challenge, because and life has challenges. If I lose an arm, then that's going to be a challenge for how I have to go through and experience life.
And it's probably a little bit different because some people may go into their marriage aware of some of the limitations of something like this, but it's also possible that something could happen later in your marriage that would change this, where you have to kind of look at this area of your life, and it would change things. So does that change how someone might approach dealing with this? I mean, obviously, I think there's conversations probably that definitely need to be had probably around this, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're committed to a person in marriage, this should not be a deal breaker if for some reason something happens and you can't have physical sex. That I would hope that relationship would be built on things beyond that would sustain through that. Will it be a challenge in certain ways? May it be a temptation for one spouse or the other? Yeah, I mean, I don't deny that it may add those things to that, but
the honesty of that. Let me stop for that, because if someone's honest, I'm just playing this out. If they're in this situation, they're aware of the limitations, whatever they may be, and somebody kind of does start admitting to the other, it is hard for me. That's something that's a struggle for me, because I wish we could have that and we can't for whatever reasons are. Should that other person feel that they are failing their spouse or their marriage because they can't be that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
And I think this is where even so let's see, scenario that for whatever kind of medical, physical, something's happened even, and so one person can no longer do this, and the other person, there can be some struggle there. So and I'm struggling with this. The person who is struggling there, I think, should be honest about that, but also has, I think, a really important role to play in how they love that spouse who's now limited and seek to free them from the shame that might get tied up here.
Yeah, because I think it's easy for people to take some of the passages in the scripture about a wife should give herself to her husband, a husband should give himself to his wife. If you for some reason can't, they feel like obligations at times, and in this case maybe burdensome obligations that can't be fulfilled, that almost feels like you're biblically not being what you should be able to be. And I think that can be heavy for a lot of people. So I just want to make sure
we've talked about this in previous panels. If you're having feelings of guilt and shame and failure, those aren't feelings that are coming from God.
No, and that's not any of the parts of the real intimate sexual connection that you're supposed to be building either. To me, that's a symptom of a breakdown of that.
Yeah.
Because you're losing more than the physical there.
I think Brendan's point is, I think when we find ourselves in challenges like this and other kinds of challenges, can we trust that there will be a grace of God to meet us in that will, see us through despite the challenge that we may not be able to fix in all cases.
Yeah. Okay. Other comments before I move on? Okay. Next question. I like to feel desired and lusted after by my spouse because it turns me on. Is that wrong?
Like I said, I think we've kind
We've
of
sort of touched on
answered
this.
that that distinguishing between desire and lust, and so I'm not quite sure what they mean, but I think proper distinguishing that to feel desired by my spouse is a good thing, and how we distinguish that from lust we've talked about. I get maybe a question is, because it turns me on, is that like is that like, at least I might have a red flag here, at least asking. I don't want to assume because
Maybe I should
a yellow
flesh
flag,
this
yellow
out.
card here.
Yellow card.
Yeah, I don't want to assume because of how they worded the question that they necessarily mean this. My follow-up question would be, are you seeking your own, is this still, has this become a self-gratification thing?
Well, let me flesh it out, because I think I have a little bit of context on where this one came from. So let me play this out, if I may, just to round out the situation. I think, and I'm going to pick on women for just a second here, because I think this is part of the maybe natural design gone awry. But I think in our culture, it is very common. There is kind of this, I don't know if it's a movement or just a thought process or what you would call it, but for women, that being like almost this little plug, it's nice to want to be used. That kind of desire where someone wants to kind of just take you is like nice and alluring and somehow a positive for you. Like some would say maybe that's a version of female empowerment. I don't know if I'd go that far. Some people would, but that being wanted in that kind of way to that extent is satisfying for them to feel that off of somebody else. So what I think this question is using the word lust, I think, correctly.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
I think there would be some nuances there between wanted to be wanted versus wanted to be used. There's some nuances there that need to be fleshed out and talked about. But even like I feel like feel desired, and that turns me on. Like I think that in some respects that's how intimacy does work. Like I'm attracted to my wife, therefore by me desiring her, you attract to each other, and it grows intimacy together. But the question, the nuances, the lusted and the used, those type of things where I at least want to talk more and have further conversation of like.
Because I do think there's something in the natural design to some degree, and I'm not saying it doesn't work in other ways, but that men seem to enjoy wanting and women seem to enjoy being wanted. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't work in any other dynamic, but I do think there seems to be some kind of a pattern there. And maybe there's something by design there. I don't know. I haven't really thought that one all the way through. But I think if that's the case, this feels like a little bit of a twist of that.
Yeah, I would, again, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be desired,
right?
And wanting to be desired a lot, But lust, by its very nature, is somewhat abusive, dehumanizing, and it's not for your good.
Yeah.
And why would you, if that's true, why would you want? To be treated that way?
I think we're back to the three pillars of what are you sacrificing right now?
Is there something else going on here that's causing you to feel like you should be treated that way? Or, I don't know.
Or what you might believe that is what's satisfying to you that you might think is the
so
ultimate
maybe
thing.
I'd say cultivate desiring your spouse and being desired by your spouse, but be aware that there are some ways that could go wrong.
Yeah, and it sounds like for both people too, because you're provoking somebody else into a lustful state. I don't know that that's loving to them, but also the way that you're responding to that doesn't feel like a healthy engagement with that either, because you're now thrilled at their kind of sinful struggle and downfall, which doesn't, I don't know, this just doesn't seem quite as loving.
Well, and that's why I think this whole topic is, it's so messy, because in many respects I think church worldwide is late to the game and talking about some of these things, and so people are bringing such baggage into these conversations, such baggage into their realities because of past history. It makes it very nuanced and layered, because there's heart issues going on all over the place, as well as skewed desires and disordered loves and everything else.
Yeah. All right. Next question. My spouse wants to have sex far more than I want to, and I don't really enjoy it. What should I do? And am I sinning by not wanting them as often or by saying no at times? This is a question actually someone texted into. They're questioning for people who have different sex drives.
That's a great question. I don't think it's uncommon for, husbands and wives' sexual appetites to be different. The only answer that I would have to this is I would hope that they could talk through this and, try to work through it in a way that seems to work for both people. And
because the biblical principle here is that 1 Corinthians 7 of the wife, the husband has authority over the wife's body, and the wife has authority over the husband's body, and it's a self-giving kind of thing. And so, but then how does that work when that desire is mismatched? That's challenging. And so I think maybe if as we've been saying, if part of the role of sexuality in marriage is to further the intimacy and the covenant of companionship, I think maybe that goes for both the good things and the challenges, because this would be a challenge, a normal, natural challenge that everyone's going to experience in their marriage. At one point or other, the desires get mismatched, rise and fall, whatever. And so I think you should approach the challenge here with that same way as how can we approach this challenge in a way that furthers our intimacy and companionship? And that probably means let's talk about this.
Right. Yeah, and I think if love, considers the good of the other as your first priority, if you have two people doing that together, trying to work through something like this, I would have hope and confidence that they could sort that out in a way.
And I think, and if they're doing that, they're like really communicating well and growing in their love for one another by how they're doing that, then I would say even in their mismatched desires, their sexuality is functioning properly in their marriage because it's leading them to that.
Yeah.
I agree with all this. Communication is huge. I think the other piece of it, again, is asking back to the heart of why, like what is going on behind the scenes, and are you disordering the importance of the physical over other aspects of your marriage that's then causing issues in the bedroom in that process? So I think that the reality is that it's all of your lives are more intertwined and have aspects of intimacy across the board that are way more than just the physical. And I think I would argue that oftentimes the physical in this world is it's because you're overemphasizing one and you're not addressing the other as well.
But I think this is a very common reality in marriages. Again, I remember in the survey I referred to earlier, it said that men think about sex like 15 times a day, and women once a week, or I forget what the number was, but much, much less. And so for men, their sexual appetite can often be just, different.
Yeah, but this can also work in the reverse, because I've heard plenty of cases where this is the reverse.
So if you hear that and think, well, I'm in a different, that doesn't mean you're weird or anything.
Yeah. This is just generalities from the survey. But.
And I think that just shows that I think is the mismatch in sexual desire is not, it could be an indication of something else going on. So that's why communication is important, but it's not necessarily. I think it's just normal.
Yeah, it's not like a bad thing or always necessarily a symptom that you two are not automatically on the same page. It's probably more what happens next that's probably where things can go. But I get your point. I mean, it's one thing if someone...
It can be a contributing factor.
Yeah,
sure.
I mean, yeah. So that takes me to another question, though, because it is possible, this is a texting question, and this bleeds well, so, that there are times where people sometimes withhold this kind of intimacy for different reasons, but not all of them are always good reasons, or sometimes like if there's a disagreement or an argument or something like that. So this question, to what extent should a spouse sacrificially engage in physical intimacy if there are unresolved issues or offenses that haven't been talked through where there is not any desire on the part of the giver?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for particularly, and again, I'm generalizing here, but these are things that have sort of been shown to be true. For women, their sexuality and their emotional intimacy is much more connected. And if there are unresolved issues in the relationship, that's going to affect a female, the wife in that relationship, probably a lot more. Men tend to compartmentalize sex much more. It's not as connected to them. They can kind of put it off in a box somewhere.
Not that that's necessarily a good or bad thing.
Yeah, this is just kind of the way they're wired
it tends to go.
in general. So particularly for a woman, that can be a challenging thing. And the one thing I would say is to the husbands, you really need to be aware of how important the state of your relationship in general is to your wife and her ability to enter into and really engage fully in the sexual relationship in your marriage. And if you're blind to that or you don't realize that, you're not going to serve her well, in helping her to not only experience fulfillment in that, but to be able to help you experience fulfillment in that.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
And I think this is where the question is coming from. If sexuality is kind of a part of the larger intimacy and covenant of companionship, then it's one of the tools in the toolbox of furthering intimacy. So it sounds kind of like what they're saying is, can this be used as a problem-solving tool?
Or a teaching method almost, because it sounds like if something's not resolved, it's like I'm going to, and I'm assuming here, so if this isn't what you're trying to do, sorry, but that by withholding that almost communicates something is more severe or drastic or proves
Is
the
that
point,
what the question
or
was?
kind of lets
I
it
heard
be
the
known.
question really differently. Can you read
To
it one
what
more time?
extent should a spouse sacrificially engage in physical intimacy if there are unresolved issues or offenses that haven't been talked through where there is not any desire on the part of the giver?
Yeah, 'cause it sounds like that's something different.
That's the alternative.
That's the...
Because either you're going to sacrificially enter in or you're withholding. So
okay,
to me,
so
that's
you're
the
in an
alternative.
argument and you're mad at your spouse, but your spouse wants to have sex, and you're like, oh, I don't want to do that right now.
Right,
So
because
what do you do?
there's only two options in my mind. You're either going to or you're not.
Now I understand where you were.
I'm thinking, yeah.
And that's where I think I go back to communication is key and talk through things. And obviously, physical intimacy being part of intimacy, it works alongside of communication and talking through things, whatever else. That to me is there's got to be a third path. Like it's not a I'm just going to suck it up and do it even though I don't feel like it. It's not a I'm withholding because I'm angry, but there's a third path there that is the way of grace and Jesus in that process.
Yeah, I think your third option is less about what I do or don't do and more about how do I get back to the place that's the heart of this to restore this so that it could be what it's meant to be, because both of the other two options don't necessarily get you there.
Yeah.
Withholding or just giving it up.
You're sacrificing one of the people in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of what pursuing that relational intimacy looks like in that situation is trying to come to, a husband understanding that these things matter and how they affect his wife sexually, and being considerate and not being demanding, and a wife being honest and sharing kind of what's bothering her and what's going on and why she's not feeling comfortable, in terms of a sexual situation. So you're pursuing that overall oneness together, and hopefully working through those things so that you can experience the fullness of it for both people in a self-love, self-giving, loving way.
Yeah. Another texting question that we have that I think is connected to some of what we were recently saying is, in light of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 4 through 5, what does that really mean and how does it apply practically? Should you never say no to one another, and how can that be abused?
Yeah, and that's the verse of, wife has authority over husband's body.
Yeah.
So like the question, like
further comments.
like how does that flesh out practically? Can you say no? And that's where it's this balance of there is sort of a paradox here that okay, I have authority over my wife's body, and yet at the same time she has authority over mine, and so. It's hard to give some like practicals, like here's 5 things that means. I think what it means is that the design is a balance of authority stooping down to serve, because Jesus said that's what authority looks like. That's what greatness looks like. And so if my authority of my wife's body really is me serving her, and her authority over my body really is her serving me. And so it's not about what, like, you're not allowed to say no anymore. Like, that's kind of missing the point of what authority is supposed to look like. Yeah,
this verse, would you agree that this verse is not saying you can never say no?
Yeah, I think what it does is, in my mind, it gives both the authority to say, I would like to blank, and both the authority to say, I'd rather not do that. And therefore be able to have the communication and the respect and the sacrificial, self-giving love to be able to work together to figure out what that looks like then. It's not a blanket, well, I do what I want. That's not loving the other
whenever
person.
First person asks wins.
Yeah, because really it's the same question of the mismatched desire, which is like that, one spouse wants to, the other one has had a long day at work, isn't into it. Like, that's the same thing. And I think the mutuality of that mutual authority and respect and love is all just pointing at what we've been saying, that this is about intimacy and companionship. And so if you discover that mismatch, one spouse says no, then the next step is, okay, what does intimacy and companionship look like here? Let's talk about this.
Yeah, okay. Other thoughts before I move on? No? Okay. If my spouse wants to do things in the bedroom that I don't, such as using toys, styles of sex, etc., what do I do? If I don't think it's sin, does that mean I should be selfless and try those things? If I'm not comfortable, does that mean I'm sinning if I try it anyway?
So
repeat the last part of the question.
Which
the last question they asked.
If I'm not comfortable, does that mean I'm sinning if I try it anyway? Is that the part you want?
I was thinking about this, and maybe because I think this is what this person is asking, but maybe I'll try to reframe it to kind of give some clear biblical guidelines. I think there's 2 possible scenarios here. One is my spouse wants to do something, and I, in kind of that conviction level, again, that Romans kind of 14, 15 thing, that my conviction level is I'm uncomfortable with that. I think Romans 14 is clear, is that it's sin for you to violate your conscience if it's something that you're not comfortable with. Now, if they're saying that it's not a conviction thing, and it's just like I'm not really into that, then I think it's just, again, then we're back to the communication and intimacy and talk these things out.
Yeah, and I think that part of the question in my mind is, spouse wants to, you don't feel like you have to by any means. Like, as an ongoing conversation you work through together, and if you're feeling pressured, that's your spouse being unkind to you, and you guys need to work through those things together in communication. Because if you are not comfortable and there's pressure there, then it's unloving and unkind for the other person to force you to do something.
Something has already gone wrong there.
Exactly.
If your spouse is pressuring you to do something that you're not really sure about, you can let's talk about that. Have open communication, talk about that. But pressure means
You shouldn't feel that way.
Yeah,
Now, that
it
could
already
also
gone wrong
be
from the self-giving love.
self-perceived pressure.
Yes.
Yeah, so it
So
might
it
not
doesn't
really be
mean
like
that
they might.
someone's
That's a good
pressuring
point. They
you.
might not be intending it as pressure, but you feel like though they keep bringing this up.
But then we're looking at, again, the trust, the intimacy, the openness,
Yeah.
the honesty to be direct with the person that you're dealing with here about where you're really coming from. So even if they're not doing that to you and pressuring you, if you're feeling pressured, that's still something I think that needs to be sorted out and worked through, even if it's just internally.
That's where it goes back to me is the communication, and the other piece we talked about before is just checking the heart of the why. Like, why is this thing so important that they want to push that envelope?
Or are you making it seem like it's more important to them because
Yep.
you're not being honest and
Yep.
you're feeling like you have to do everything that somebody wants or somebody says. And, again, we're back to the conversation that I think you guys were talking about. So, okay. Other thoughts on that before I move on? No? Okay. I'm going to go to some texting questions. So, is it necessary to have your marriage approved by the state? Keep in mind that some states consider same-sex marriages acceptable. Why should the government be involved?
That's interesting. So,
Essentially, being married, including things like physical intimacy, without being state recognized as married.
So like, let's just say I'm gonna like flesh out a scenario here of like you do a church wedding, pastor, I now pronounce you husband and wife, but you don't do any of the state paperwork. You don't fill out a marriage certificate. Is that, like, I guess, are they saying like, is that a real marriage with that? I think maybe that's what they're asking.
Maybe as opposed to married in the eyes of God and public people. I don't know. I mean, if that's not your question, text it and clarify that.
I don't
but
know
I'm
that I've
assuming
ever
that's it.
thought about that, but one thing that would be evident is, marriage in the eyes of the state conveys certain benefits and privileges and, everything from how you file your taxes to all kinds of other things that you would obviously forego if you wanted to be married somehow and not have it be recognized by the state. Whether you would be married if a pastor performed a marriage and there was no state, well...
Yeah, because they're asking if it's necessary.
Yeah, because
I
think part of the question in my mind is the why. What's the desire to not do that point? Because I think what it does in my mind is that it, in some ways, depending on how you think about it, what I would think about it is it would lessen the commitment you're really making because you're making an easier exit possibility.
That's a good question.
And
it
that's
didn't
where,
sound like that's what they were coming from.
But I think to me, it's at least asking the question of why. Because if it's one of the benefits here without necessarily, but you're leaving the door open a little bit. So the reason why I brought that up is because I just was down in Mexico for the past week, and it's quite common for them to do common law marriages where they join together and not recognized by the state.
Okay.
What that does, though, is that it's created a situation where husbands can vacate whenever the heck they feel like it. And they
there's
do
no
a lot.
actual
And there's
consequence
no
or
consequence to it
support
whatsoever,
for
and
that.
it leaves the
I see.
female hang out to dry a lot. And so to me, there's at least a question of like, why are you trying to keep an exit door easier access
You're saying,
rather
like,
than have to go through the extra steps to the state
Why
you have to
do
take?
less
Yeah,
commitment
and-
But,
if it's there?
I wonder if what I'm hearing in that question and the way it's phrased, and I could be wrong, is a discomfort with the state because of their
That's
position.
possible
because of the state's
too.
definition of marriage
Yeah.
and stuff. Yeah, and so maybe even just something to toss back to this person is I definitely understand that the
'cause
state
their
has
question is, why should the
redefined
government be
marriage to
involved?
be something that's
Yeah.
unbiblical. However, I think even looking at the situation in Mexico, I think does show that even when the state is distorting and warping and changing the definition of marriage, there is a sort of a common grace to this that I think some of those laws have produce good outcomes, are intended for stability of families. And so to remove that entirely, to let's just say we get the state out of the marriage business entirely. And I think we're kind of turning this in going off topic here, but is maybe an interesting thing to think through. But that is a unintended consequence that there is a common grace from when the state at least has some guide, some borders and some consequences for doing things, like that's good.
And plus, I think having marriage recognized by the state also serves as some protections in many ways for both members of, of that marriage. There's property protections and things like that. And, so there are clearly, to me, the benefits of having your marriage recognized by the state versus not.
So I think maybe the way I'd try to come down on this is it necessary? Like, no, I don't think it makes it an illegitimate marriage, and it's not a real marriage if the state doesn't sign off on it. I don't think that's the case, because it's what God joins together. However, I think the reality of marriage is a covenant of companionship. There are multiple dimensions to that. There's the sexual, there's the spiritual, there's the physical, but there's also the kind of the economic and the familial. And that's where the state's role in sort of governing some of those economic spheres, how your marriage does relate to that. You're not just on an island by yourself. And so that's where it's valuable, at least.
Okay. Other thoughts? I mean, that's a good question. If that doesn't fully answer that, feel free to text back in and let us know if there's more to that.
Maybe we'll need to do
missed.
another panel on
I know,
that.
that's a whole different situation. Popcorn question, because this is a little offside too. Where does it say Joseph and Mary were married before their trip to Bethlehem? I think this is the footer to the other question. Where does it say Joseph and Mary were married before their trip to Bethlehem?
Well, they weren't married, they were betrothed, which means betrothal in biblical times is it's kind of halfway between engagement and marriage in our day. It's a commitment where you are committed to one another, but you have not fully kind of entered into marriage where that's been consummated. So it's more than are engaged, but less than being married.
Yeah, and it has the legal dimensions of marriage in place, and so like Joseph would have had to divorce her to break the betrothal, but you haven't yet fully entered into that covenant of companionship and all that it entails.
As a matter of fact, the angel says, "Do not be afraid to take her as your wife." So that hasn't fully happened.
And so with that, I think that the timeline there, it is unclear whether did that happen. So when did they actually then tie the knot? Was it before? It was definitely after the angel visit, because at that point, they're only just betrothed.
Right.
Was it after Bethlehem or before? We're not told, and in some ways, I don't think it quite matters to the point of that story.
Okay. The key points of where you need to know where they were are mentioned, but not the conclusion of some of those details. Okay. All right. Other question.
We do know one more thing.
Go ahead.
This time, we do know, because I think it's Matthew, I think, that makes this explicit, that regardless of when exactly they tied the knot, they did not consummate that marriage sexually, at least until after Jesus was born. That part at least is clear.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. What advice do you have for two people about to get married in terms of how to have a conversation before marriage about the role of sex in the marriage? And how often do you suggest having a follow-up conversation? Does Grace offer premarital classes or one-on-one counseling?
Yes, we offer premarital counseling. We'd love to talk to you through this
And one
stuff.
of those sessions is
talking about sex.
sexual intimacy.
Okay.
And to me, there's a couple pieces of it. One would be not causing yourself temptation by having the conversation. I think the conversation can be important, but be smart. Like, I remember I did a premarital class. I was a different state in the church. We did a class with a number of us, and they gave us different CDs and Song of Solomon. They basically gave explicit instructions. Don't listen to this together late at night, like in your bedroom. Like, don't be stupid. And so it's like, being smart about when and where you have the conversation could be helpful.
And maybe how
temptation.
deep or specific those conversations need to go.
Exactly.
Maybe that happens in stages or layers or, progressive as you are moving towards
that's
marriage.
It's an ongoing conversation for the rest of your marriage. It's a lifelong.
Yeah, this is a lifelong thing.
Yeah,
So,
but I mean,
so you
this
don't need to
sounds
have
like
this all figured
this
out
sounds
before
like
your wedding night.
before marriage, though. So this
And I wouldn't
person's
necessarily
asking
do
the
this, like,
lead
it's
up to that, with the conversations that happen in that space.
It's not the first conversation you have in engagement. Let's put
No,
it that way.
but it is an important conversation to have before you get married,
Yeah.
because you want to talk about expectations and how you each think about these things, and what do you expect of your wife, what do you expect of your husband.
Should you have this conversation before you're engaged? If you're thinking of marrying somebody, is there anything in this that you would want to have some level? I'm not saying levels are varying in this, but some kind of conversation about any of this prior, or would you not?
A rule, but I would probably think that conversation is more appropriate when you've gotten to the point where you think you're going to take the step of being married.
I would agree with that. I wouldn't feel it was a necessary step pre-engagement.
Or at least
Well,
at the point where you're like, yes, we're moving towards marriage.
Well, this is why I'm asking. This is the only reason I'm thinking. As the single person up here, if I was, well, I'm not even going to put me in it. It's extremely common to go on dates, to go out and talk to people and have some of this stuff come up because somebody might be involved in something that we've already talked about or have it as a priority. If that comes up, does that affect the way that you want to proceed with that person, or should you be waiting to run into that information until after you're already engaged to them? Because for some people, if you find out
I get the point.
If you find out the guy that you were, thinking was a great, wonderful person has a serious porn addiction and he's not sure if he's going to be able to kick that or if he wants to, does that change the way you want to play this out? It might.
Yeah, I mean, I get the point, although engagement is exactly that. It's you're not married yet. And
you're not even betrothed.
And so if it's certainly true and happens at times that things can come up during an engagement period that would cause people to reconsider.
Okay.
So,
and that's not a problematic thing in your guys' opinion for that window?
You would
That's not
hope
like
that doesn't happen, but I don't know that you can always cover every base. I mean, I think this is maybe a plug for the wisdom of making sure you take time to really get to know one another, in the process of even moving towards engagement. But you may not be able to know everything about.
Okay.
Yeah. Oftentimes we can be blinded in our dating time to a lot of the realities, and so taking the time to really consider those things is important. And if not pre-engagement, during engagement, in the counseling, premarital counseling, those things should come up. If you're not in a situation where you're going through premarital counseling, you're not talking about these things, I would see it as an issue, and find other places you can talk about these things because they are very important.
Yeah.
Which is really one of the main purposes of premarital counseling. Yeah. It's not to give you, it is to give you instruction, biblical instruction at some level, but it's really to get you talking about the things that will shape your marriage, including your sexual intimacy.
Yeah, it's to set you up with tools for this covenant of companionship in all of your different areas of your marriage.
Okay. So to take all the pieces, you would recommend people talk about it before they're married, but not necessarily just while they're casually dating, unless there's a reason it comes up specifically. And you are saying it's going to be a continuous conversation. So about follow-up and how often, it's just a continuous conversation. There is no date points for that. And do we offer premarital counseling? Yes, we do. And most of this will be addressed if you take it with someone here.
So
yes?
sign up now.
If you're dating and you're over the guy you're dating's house and you see his porno collection on the wall, it might be a conversation you'd want to have.
Not my big conversation. That should be a conversation point.
Yeah. First question is, why are you displaying it? That's a bold move.
We live in a weird world.
What a move. Anyway, not a power move, but just a move. So, next question. My spouse and I tend to have conflict around things in our sex life. I know our intimacy is a private thing between us, but I feel like we might need help to work some things through, and they don't want to talk to or involve anyone else in this area of our lives. Am I unable to honor them and still get help by talking to someone? What am I able to share if I want help and they don't?
Well, I think, in my mind, at the end of the day, what you're dealing with in your heart is still, if you feel like you need counsel, seek counsel. It doesn't mean you're going to talk to somebody and it's going to be the news of the entire church. Like, if you're a female having issues here, we have lay counselors that you can talk to that are that can talk you through these things. It doesn't ever have to go beyond that conversation.
Yeah, but is it disrespectful to do that if your spouse is saying, I don't really want anybody in this from us? Like, they're kind of asking you to be not bring anybody into it because this is between the two of you and it's private, and they just don't want someone else in that piece of your marriage.
I would at least,
is that disrespectful or unsubmissive or unhonoring if you're not, like, to break out of that?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And again, these things have to be parsed through kind of carefully because there's obligations on both spouses' side in marriage and for the good of the marriage. And yes, I think if you're feeling like you're struggling in some area like this and you need some help, I would certainly first appeal and go that route. But at some point, if you are concerned about the danger of this to your marriage and it's serious enough, at some point, I think, and this is just my thoughts on it, I would go to my spouse and say, look, I've asked numerous times about this and you seem uncomfortable. I believe this is too important for the health of our marriage not to try to get some help. If you're not willing, I'm going to talk to somebody. I don't want to dishonor you in how I'm going to do that, but for the sake of our marriage and my love for you, I can't let things keep going without trying to do something to make things better.
Would also that degree have to do with the level of maybe not just the marriage connection, but also the condition, I guess, of your own spirit in how you're dealing with this? Because as much as marriage is between two people, you are still before the Lord as a child of God, and how you handle all of this stuff. And if you feel like you're just wrestling and you cannot seem to get past this and let it go, and there's no way to deal with that, is that priority, even if it's not for your spouse, is that priority enough for you to put that forward and not be sinning?
Could be, but the obligation on the other side of that fence is if you're the spouse who's being appealed to and you hear your spouse saying, this is important, I'm concerned about the state of our marriage, why would you... not
Well, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with this kind of
it's
thing, bringing
different.
people in. And what that even means, like, if it means
I
just
get it.
telling your friends, or like going to counseling, or talking to a
finding
pastor,
somebody
or
that you
an
feel,
accountability group
this
for
is-
you
yeah,
that's
this
of the
is-
same gender. I don't know.
There's lots. There
It's
could be lots of
open.
options. I understand why the spouse is uncomfortable with that, and so is there some sort of middle ground or safe thing that we can figure out to do? But yeah, I would say at the end of the day, if that spouse who doesn't want to, who doesn't want to get anyone else involved, if you're unwilling to do that when your spouse is appealing to you, that's not love. And so that I would have some words for you if
And you're running the risk of sacrificing your marriage for what is probably something related to your own pride. You're just uncomfortable with having this exposed.
So there's probably there might be pride here, there might be shame here, but this is something I think that Christ would call you to lay down for the good of your spouse. Lay that down and go to counseling with them.
I think for some people, it might just be the idea that other believers out there being a part of this part of your life would be an uncomfortable thing. But that feels, again, like an unhealthy connection in relation to the way that you deal with the issues in the area of sex in your life.
For sure. I mean, the Bible talks about it. Talks about it in the context of a 1 Corinthians, a church community. I think that obviously the appeal to me, that's the 100% the first thing is having the communication, having the conversation of like the whys, like what's holding them back from having these conversations, and be able to work through those things together. But be able to get to the point where if it's unwillingness still, be able to appeal eventually to the point of we need help for the sake of our marriage.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as the second part of the question, what am I able to share if I want help and they don't? I'm assuming this is an attempt to still be respectful if for some reason they're not changing their opinion on this. Is there an appropriate or inappropriate way for you to bring this area of your marriage to another person for a healthy reason. Obviously, you can bring issues like this in your marriage for unhealthy reasons to people, and I would assume that's not a good thing to do.
Yeah,
You don't want to just throw this around.
Yeah,
this
you're not
isn't,
like complaining or gossiping with your friends.
Yeah, or just spilling your personal business. I
Yeah.
would assume that kind of protected privacy is not edifying for people.
I think so. In some ways, this is kind of this might be an oversimplification depending on the details of the situation. But in some ways, if you're getting to that point where you feel like, no, I have to talk to somebody, that's sort of my conscience before God does at some point trump my submission to my spouse here, because God is a higher authority than my spouse. But even when that happens, in the rare cases that has to happen, the goal should still be as far as I can possibly go to respect this lower authority. And anything that I can do, go out of my way as far as I can to honor this person, even though I have to, before God, violate what they're telling me to do. And so if, let's say, if your spouse is really uncomfortable with this, just because this is like, there's some shame here, they don't want anyone, like any of her friends knowing, well, then don't talk to one of your friends. Go like say, I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to an actual counselor about this, and they don't know us from Adam or whatever, but I have to talk to somebody to find a way to try to, as far as you can, meet your spouse in that. I think that's how you honor somebody.
And maybe,
even when you have to
I don't
go
know if
against
there's
them.
principles for how to even talk about this kind of area with people as you bring them in, so that you're not either, being disrespectful, making something maybe crude or more vulgar or graphic than needs to be, or betraying trust in the privacy that you do still want to maintain for this, because this is still a private matter. I don't think this is something where, because there's no shame in this part of our existence, that it should be out there for everybody and everyone needs to know what you're doing. I don't think that's the takeaway here. So is there a method for how to share? Like, if someone wanted to have a conversation, maybe styled like even what we're doing right now with someone, where we're talking about topics, but also principles and, the goal of what we're trying to get to here, instead of getting into like super graphic details. Is that a good way to approach?
Well,
I don't know.
I would say two things. First, I would think the same principles apply in how you would share about any conflict. So you do your best to try to honor the person on the other side. You don't speak of them in judgment. You don't kind of put them down. You don't throw them under the bus. You don't make it their fault. And as far as how much you share, I think the guideline that I would say is as little as necessary to communicate the point.
Okay. All right. And so as far as like, if one person is struggling with this or any of the other things that we've brought up today, if there's struggle in that and somebody wants to address it, how would you recommend them proceed?
I think we talked before, appealing to the spouse first, talking to them, like have communication about it, talk with it, and then if necessary, bring in counsel.
Okay.
Whether it be one of us, a lay counselor, other counseling, whatever is necessary. Obviously, the caution in my mind, if you go outside the church context of counseling, is they might be thinking about this from a clinical area and not necessarily a Christian perspective, and that can skew how they would proceed.
And that is possible even of Christian labeled
Yes.
counseling as well. Just, it's something that I think everyone has to be biblically alert to as they listen for advice, that you test all of that advice as well.
And I would also want to say the church should be a safe place to talk about these kinds of challenges. And so I would say in the church, choose wisely who you pick to share with. But I would also want to say that pastorally, we would be committed to the confidence and confidentiality and protecting and trying to honor that situation in a way that if something came to us, we'd be really careful with that.
Yeah,
For
and
sure.
even if you're trying to figure out if any of these guys would judge you for what you might bring forward, consider the vibe of this conversation, because if this is how you guys would feel and interact around this stuff, then this is the kind of conversation you would hopefully be able to have with them if you came and talked to them about yourself.
And we all have areas of struggle that we struggle with. Like, the reality is we're all sinful, fallen people. And so whether it be a struggle in this area or another area, the reality is we all have our issues, and so being able to look at each other with grace and forgiveness and freedom and love is exactly what needs to happen.
Yeah, this is not a place for condemnation on this stuff. I think we've tried to spend most of this time recognizing how, not normal, but how this is a piece of people's lives, and we're not treating this like it's some, dirty, horrible, weird, secret thing. There's some level of normalcy to a lot of the wrestling that goes on in this, and I think it seems like you guys would like to treat it that way while still trying to honor what the Bible has to say about it to help people. So, okay. So final question. If you're someone who is realizing after this conversation that maybe there are some things that you're not feeling so great about, or you've made some mistakes and you have done damage to your marriage in some way through those mistakes in this area, how do you go about repairing that? How do you move forward? Because I think there's hope for those people. If you're sitting there and you're listening to us after all of this, or even before we started talking, and you find yourself, you're already feeling like, I've messed some stuff up, or I think I have not handled this the way that I would like to. Maybe just even feeling like you lost the heart of what this was supposed to be about, but you haven't explicitly done anything you feel like you shouldn't have done. How do you go about building the healthy marriage relationship that we've sat up here and tried to kind of construct from Scripture for people, where it's full and it's healthy? How do you repair from damage to get there? What do you do?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing in my mind is go to the foot of the cross. The cross doesn't discriminate sins. Like, seek Jesus' forgiveness first, and then go seek the forgiveness of your spouse and talk with them and have the conversation, communication. Open those channels in a way that maybe you haven't before, and actually have the conversation of being able to own what you've done wrong as God's convicted you, and be able to bring them into that too. Because in my mind, it is the power of being able to not just say sorry, but actually seek forgiveness and ask forgiveness, bring them into that together. That will bring unity in some form or fashion, hopefully, and then be able to be committed with each other to work through those things together, talk through those things, and committed to changing perhaps even the style of conversations in this area, having those ongoing conversations and commitment to honor and love one another. Just because we haven't done it previously, it doesn't mean it can't start today.
That's good.
Yeah, grace, I think the point about the cross is God's grace is bigger than any mistake. And any failures and any faults we may have made, no matter what they are. So I think we start from the standpoint of being forgiven and, God's commitment to us and his desire to want to see our marriages reflect, his glory and his character. And there's a quote I really like from a little devotional book I use, and it says this. It says, in the highest commands, in other words, the most challenging things that we would be called to do, consider Christ not as an exactor to require. And what that means is someone who's sitting across the table saying, come on, you need to get this together. But as a debtor, as someone to work in you and for you. And I really like that picture in these kinds of challenges, that Jesus he's not across the table kind of saying, come on, get it together. What's wrong with you? But he says, no. He says, I died so I could come around the table, put my arm around you, and help you to change.
And obviously, all that said, things like this oftentimes can break an incredible amount of trust. And trust takes time to develop. Intimacy takes time to develop. And so it won't be overnight. Maybe something where maybe it is a situation where a husband has a porn addiction, hasn't talked to his wife about it. Bringing that to the light is massively huge, but that's going to do some damage to your wife as well. And to be able to walk through that over time and know it's not going to be okay overnight is incredibly important to understand. But also, long run, intimacy can develop again. There is hope for that to develop again. It's not a once broken, always broken. It is the gospel changes things and provides grace and provides the opportunity to build that again.
Yeah, and the reason, and I think one of the reasons this is supposed to be happening in the covenant of marriage is that this is a lifelong thing. That these things take time. They take time to do well, and they take time to fix. And so maybe I would say if you or your spouse, if you're in your marriage, you're struggling with these things, go to 1 Corinthians 13 and write down, the love is patient. Write down all of these things: patient, kind, et cetera, and say, okay, what does that look like in this conflict, or in this breach of trust, or in this trying to rebuild this individual, or trying to do better in this area? What does patience and kindness, et cetera, all the way down the list look like here?
And not only is that a commitment to one another, it's a commitment in a community. And to be able to bring that and have fellow believers around you, be able to walk alongside you guys in that process is incredibly important as well. And I know it can bring shame, but the healing that can be found within community is massive as well.
Yeah. So in summary, it sounds like because of the cross, there is redemption for any place that you find yourself in this. And we would support and encourage you to still believe in that promise of what God has for you, that this is something that's still out there for you, and that there's hope for that, that anything can be redeemed and restored no matter where you're starting from because of the cross. Fair conclusion?
That's I think the one challenge in this as well is maybe it's a situation where there was an affair that can lead to real world consequences of our sin. That can lead to an opening of potential door of divorce. And it's scary and ugly. Yeah. But being right before God and on the cross is more important, and being able to live in the light is more important than that, even in some respects.
Yeah.
Would you agree or disagree? Anything to add to that? Yeah. Because it does open the door for potential consequence in that regard of our sin.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. Living in the darkness never has a good ending. Because if you've done something, if you've been in an adulterous affair and your spouse doesn't know, your intimacy, you cannot, develop that, because there's a piece of your life that you can't share. And that piece will not only eat at you, but it will, eat at your relationship. And so it's risky, being honest and truthful, but there's no other path to good other than doing that. And so you do that wisely, you do it carefully, and you do it for the right reasons. But
and so what you had said towards the beginning, that God is a generous God. Even in the hardest things he calls us to, he's still generous, and he calls us to them because these things are good, and because he's good, and because he loves us. Yeah,
I think also just the main point of this is there's something here that's really beautiful that he's given to his children that's worth fighting for. Through all of this, I know this seems like a mess of a lot of stuff that people probably have to go through. It may feel more trouble than it's worth, but I think what he's offering, the way he's intended it, is something that he has that's good, that he wants people to have the way that he's designed it. And I think that that's worth fighting for through all of this, even though I'm sure it's messy and uncomfortable, and you have to be vulnerable and humble and honest and all these other things that are probably very challenging. But I think ultimately that's probably a fair way to summarize what we've done.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think if marriage was designed by God to be a reflection of himself in different ways, then it's to be partly a reflection of the joy and love and delight that he has in his Trinitarian reality. Yeah. And so it's intended to impart some of that down for us to be able to experience, even in a broken, fallen
Yeah, because I know you said in the message a while ago that it's part of the language that's even laced throughout the scripture of how expressing the depth of his intimate love for his people, that this is kind of almost like an earth language for us to understand that. So there's more to be learned even about him and the way that he loves you when this is in right alignment. It's not just between you and that other person, but it enriches your connection with your Father too.
There's a beauty here when it functions properly. And when it's not functioning properly, when something is broken, look to the beauty that this is supposed to, and see the grace and the goodness of God here, and take heart that this can in fact be healed.
Yeah. All right. Good stuff. Other closing comments? Are we good? I know we've done the marathon, another movie. So thank you, everyone. If you're still with us, thank you especially. My goodness. Thank you for joining us in our discussion. If you have questions, comments, another topic for us to cover that you would like to hear us, or even a complaint, because we'll take those too, feel free to email us at resources@gracecommunity.org and just mention the panel title in the email title, and we would love to hear from you with anything that you have to say. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you guys next time. We will actually be doing a special panel on Wednesday this coming week that is the kind of experience of singles in the life of the church and in the body of Christ. So feel free to tune into that. It'll be Wednesday evening, and we will see you then.